My 26 female, mom passed away a few years ago. During that time, we discovered that my dad had been cheating on her with a girl my age. His whole family disowned him and cut contact with him, except for me. I guess that at the time, I wasn't ready to let go of both my parents at the same time. But over these last 5 years, I've been able to let go to the point I only see them, twice or thrice a month. It's like I have no family left. Don't get me wrong, I also blame the girl for what happened. But the responsibility toward my mom and me was my dad's, not hers. They eventually had my half-sister, Toddler. From what I've heard and know, my dad and his wife are living paycheck to paycheck, on a budget, and in a rental home since everyone in the family changed their will. Both my grandparents and my mom. My dad won't get the house because it was an eventual inheritance from my grandparents. But since she died first, I'm the sole benefactor from both sides, since my paternal grandparents skipped my dad. Now, 2 days ago, I went to visit him because it was his birthday, and he said he and his wife wanted to talk to me. I was like, yeah, okay. Then they said they wanted me to be the legal guardian of my half-sister in case something happened to them, mainly because I'll have the means for it. My dad's wife's parents can only care for her, but to a minor extent, and I'll have the money needed to take care of an innocent child. I said no, not for the money, but because I didn't want to. I'm not close to my sister, and currently I don't see nor want myself taking care of a child, much less one that is reminiscent of my mom's last heartbreak. So I said I was willing to pass along a monthly check, like a child support payment, but less than that since she's not my kid. But that was the only thing I was willing to do. My dad cried, saying that she was his baby, and I could be a good sister like I was raised to be, but I just laughed and said that he was no one to talk about good and wrong, and he and his wife should have thought of that before cheating. His wife called me a monster and kicked me out of the house. I left. Later that night, I sent my dad a text, informing him of my decision to cut ties with him completely, and that from now on, will be no contact unless it's an emergency. He's begging me to reconsider, but I don't know if I'm right or wrong. Not the idiot. They were just getting started. The first step was to get you to agree to be her guardian if something happened to them. Once they have established that you care about your half-sister and want to help her, then they'll ask you to buy her extra clothes for her birthday or take her school shopping. Then they'll ask for help because they're short on rent and must ensure their half-sister isn't homeless. Run and don't look back. I agree with everything you said, especially the asking for money and inheritance. It won't be long until they need a place to live and want to move into OP's home. Hun, your dad is with a girl your age. Got her pregnant while she was like 20? She'll be around for a good while, hopefully. Who knows? Does she not have a family either? So they can deal with whatever your father and his wife have going on. It's even better. When OP's paternal grandparents pass, they would ask for the inheritance house because it was supposed to be Dad's anyway. OP, your father has not been responsible his whole life and wants to stick you with the half-sister. How about no? Send her off to your dad's wife. It's her responsibility. It's her family's bloodline. Honestly suspicious, like they want to dump the kid on you and run away. Money. OP is the one who'll be inheriting everything. Dad gets nothing. This is just a way for him to get a toe in the door. OP, good on you for not getting caught on a slippery slope. Looking past the fact that your dad was cheating in your mom's final moments, he's an idiot. He's trying to put the responsibility onto you and using you. See how you only talk to him twice or thrice a month. He comes to see you because he wants a favor. You don't need to take care of that child at all. I, 18 female, teach preschool and babysit on the side. I'm a pretty well-known babysitter in my town and the neighboring town, and I'm booked through November. I can charge a little more than other babysitters in the area because I have a lot of experience. I've worked at summer camps, babysat, and have taught since June. I'm CPR and first aid certified, and the whole teaching thing makes my parents think you're a lot more qualified. In reality, I just called the preschool, asked if they were hiring, scheduled my interview for the next day, and was hired on the spot after a 10-minute interview. There are also only a few babysitters available because I live in a small town, population 7,000, and most teens don't work. I babysit a lot of my students. One of my students' moms texted me the other day and asked if I could babysit for a week in December. Of course, I said yes and set up a time to call her to talk about my rates and availability. This woman has 4 kids, all under 5, and her younger 2 aren't potty trained, so I told her I'd charge $40 per hour. I know this woman has a history of underpaying her babysitters, so I went a little higher than what I normally charge in preparation for some negotiation. She told me she pays her current babysitter $15 and asked if I could do that. I said no, and she started acting like I needed the babysitting job because teachers are underpaid and I only teach 15 hours a week. We ended the call and she called me the next day, offering $20 and saying this was my last chance. I told her then she clearly needed a babysitter more than I needed this job and not to call me back unless she was willing to pay at least $35. She told me she'd tell the other preschool parents how rude I was and hung up. I know for a fact she did tell some parents because one texted me later that day saying she heard I have an opening for a week in December. My grandma says I should have been more willing to negotiate, but my mom says she should have either paid my rate or left me alone. I'm feeling kind of bad about the whole thing, so I wanted to know if I was the idiot. Not the idiot. If my 18-year-old daughter came home and told me she did the same thing, I would treat her to a special dinner. Many girls and women struggle with knowing and embracing their value, so I think it's amazing that you do. I wouldn't have blamed you for going up in price simply because she was so difficult. Oh, I'm sorry. I charge a 25% markup whenever parents are condescending to me. I read this and was like, wait, this lady comments on teachers being underpaid? So she wants to underpay OP again? That's nice of her. And I had to laugh that another parent heard her bad-mouthing you, and their reaction was, OMG, OP has availability. I'd better jump right on that. That shows you're a good babysitter asking for a reasonable rate. She was attempting to manipulate you into taking an offensively low hourly wage. 4 kids, 2 in diapers, with the super shady way she pitched it? Clearly, everyone is happy with you based on their request, and that should be very telling over one bad apple. Just be grateful you didn't take the job, because I suspect she's the kind of person who would find something wrong to try and get a free job and badmouth you. I, female 29, live in Australia. I moved to Australia 5 years ago to move in with my Australian long-distance boyfriend at the time. He's now my husband, and I'm now officially an Australian citizen. I'm originally from Britain, and the rest of my family lives there. My husband and I own a house with a spare bedroom, and over the past 4 years, I've allowed my older sister, Becky, 35, and her husband and kids to vacation at our home, except during 2020, when there were travel restrictions. They are in love with Australia and are very grateful to visit here. This year, they visited last month for 2 weeks. Becky and her husband took the spare bedroom, and their kids had air mattresses in the living room. They had a great time, and it was all very pleasant. But the day after they left, I noticed that Becky and her husband completely trashed the spare room. There were food wrappers, crumbs, and plastic bottles all over the floor, food stains all over the bed, weird marks on the furniture that weren't there before, and an awful rotting smell in the room that we couldn't get rid of. I texted Becky the pictures of the room and said that this was not okay. Becky said she was sorry and said she and her husband were in holiday mode and just wanted to relax. I told her that my husband and I weren't her maids and said that she and her family were not allowed to come back next year. Becky said I'm being irrational and that it was just a little mess. I told her I didn't care and that it was mine and my husband's home and we didn't want it to be treated that way. Becky got our parents involved, and they accused me of thinking that I was better than everyone and said that I was being unfair to Becky. Am I the idiot? Not the idiot. While they're on vacation mode, you're not. That's your home. You bought those furnishings in that home with your hard-earned money. She behaved like a pig and left the sty. If she did that to a hotel room, she would be forced to pay for damages. Anyone complaining can pay for your sister's future hotel bill. LOL, not wanting your place trashed means you think you're better than everyone? I guess we know who the golden child is. She's old enough to know it's really rude to trash someone's place, especially when she's staying for free. But it seems like even her children have better manners than her. Even when I'm staying in a hotel, I try to clean up my mess a bit. But, unfortunately, she's an entitled idiot and won't even acknowledge she was wrong. So no, she doesn't get to stay with you again. If she wants to get others involved, send them the pics and ask. So if she did this to your home, then you'd be okay? 'Cause if so, I'll come visit and stay with you and do the same since it's okay. Holiday mode only works if you've paid someone for housekeeping. Guaranteed that Becky didn't give the parents the full story. Oh, we just left some empty bottles that we forgot to grab on our way out, etc. My 32 female ex-husband, Mark, 34, and I have 3 children together, 2 boys and 1 girl. They're all tweens, triplets. Our daughter's name is Ellie, and she's always been much more sensitive than her brothers. She just behaved differently than they did, and in the beginning I dismissed it as the boys being identical and her being the fraternal triplet. But with time I realized it was more than that. Ellie was eventually diagnosed as autistic when she was 4. She's a very sweet and very quiet kid. She doesn't talk very much, and she absolutely hates too much sound. Anytime we have to go somewhere, I bring her noise-canceling headphones and a few of her favorite toys, just in case the headphones don't help. Lately, when she has a meltdown, it dissolves into a panic attack, and then she'll just be completely nonverbal for a day or 2. I hate seeing her go through that, so I do everything to help her manage and avoid her triggers when possible. Mark thinks I coddle her too much, and that my efforts to help her avoid meltdowns and sensory overloads are actually just giving in to her tantrums. He's gotten better about the mindset since his girlfriend Marissa, 33, moved in with him, but sometimes he and I still argue about it. It's supposed to be his week with the kids, so I was just at home catching up on some cleaning when one of my sons called me on Marissa's cell. He said that Ellie had shut herself in her closet and refused to come out, and their dad was getting upset with her about it. So I asked him to put his dad on the phone. Mark immediately told me he could handle Ellie's fits and that our son shouldn't have grabbed Marissa's phone to call me. Still, I told him I at least wanted to talk about what had triggered Ellie to begin with, and I wanted to talk to her as well, just to see if she was okay. He said Ellie was refusing to talk and that he'd call me back when she decided to start speaking again. As soon as she hung up on me, I grabbed my keys and drove over to his house. Marissa let me in, and I went upstairs where he was lecturing Ellie through the door, and I could hear her sniffling. Mark looked angry to see me, but the boys were standing there, so he didn't say anything about it. Eventually, I got Ellie to come out of the closet, and she burst into tears and begged me to take her home. She wouldn't let go of my hand and didn't want to go anywhere near her dad. I knew she'd probably lock herself away again if I left without her, so I told Mark that if she was feeling better in the morning, I'd bring her back. He texted me a few times after we left, saying I ruined his time with Ellie, and the reason she hates it over there is that I always come to her rescue. I told my mom about it, and she thinks I shouldn't interfere with the kids when they're with their dad, even if there's an issue, because I'd hate it if he did the same thing to me. Not the idiot, mate. He's abusing her. He's refusing to take care of her disability and trying to force her to act normal. He's verbally abusing her whenever she has a meltdown. I wouldn't be surprised if that's why she has panic attacks. If you send her back, you will be a huge idiot, and you'll be an enabler in her abuse. Catering to a child's disability as a parent is not optional. It's a need, and not to is neglect. If your child isn't in therapy, she needed to be yesterday, and you need to bring this up with a therapist. Imagine if Ellie had to use a wheelchair, and then her dad refused to build a ramp and yelled at her when she couldn't use the stairs. And then when you suggest building a ramp, he says that'll just give in to her neediness and make her less likely to learn how to walk. That's what her dad's doing to her now. It's just harder to visualize the obstacles because we can't see them. Dad is a huge idiot. Mom needs to figure this out. I know going to court is expensive, but it's cheaper than the permanent toll on her child. It'll be cheaper than the cost of all the therapy she'll need if she's forced into this environment. He is your ex for a reason. He's not going to magically be a different person when interacting with your children. Let Mark be angry because he's angry he doesn't have permission to hurt her. Be your child's guardian and guard them. My husband and I have different tastes when it comes to food. That's perfectly fine. However, lately, whenever we go out to a restaurant, we both order different dishes. Then he suddenly asks to eat from my dish and would throw a fit if I refuse. He's done this several times, and I snapped at him and told him to stop asking and order from the same dishes if he wanted it so bad. Last night, we went out for dinner and ordered different dishes. Before we made the order, I asked if he was sure about the dish he picked, and he said yes. The food arrived and each of us had our plates and started eating. Literally minutes later, he asked if he could eat from my dish. I looked at him like, "Are you serious right now?" He went on about how he couldn't resist the dish's looks and wanted to try it. I refused and said no. I kept eating and he kept pushing until I blew up, and he suddenly got quiet. He then got up and walked out. He was furious with me and picked an argument at home when I returned. He said that I acted petty and that all he asked for was a few bites from my meal, and I chose to make a scene and yell and embarrass him instead. We're not speaking to each other right now because of what happened. I feel crappy about it, and I think I could have just let him have some of the food instead of choosing that silly hill to die on. Edit. We pay for our meals separately. Joey doesn't share food. LOL. That's a reference from the show Friends if you don't know, but to be serious, you've already stated your preferences and boundaries. You don't like it when he asks for food off your plate. If anything, it's silly and rude of him to continue to ask when he knows you don't like it. It's kind of petty though on your part. Most people don't care to share or offer a bite. So if that's all he's asking for is a bite, you're the idiot. But if he wants a larger share of your food, definitely not the idiot. It's the fact that he throws a tantrum when you say no that makes him the idiot. However, your marriage doesn't sound like it's all put together yet. Not gonna lie, kinda weird to know that you pay for your meals separately, but also that he's childish enough to walk out when he doesn't get his way. Everyone who doesn't understand, let me explain to you. Partners who do this after being told no don't want the food. They just want to take it from you. It's a test to see how far they can push your boundaries. It seems so simple until you look at how it blew up into a fight. If it were so innocent, a fight wouldn't have happened. This is a power play, and he's furious that she isn't giving in. This sounds like a symptom of a larger problem. Do you even like each other? Recently, my friend's husband did the same thing because he wanted to cheat. He did everything to make his wife crazy and then told her that they must separate for a while due to her bad character. He lied, of course, that this had nothing to do with cheating. He just needed time to think. But he cheated with at least 2 people that my friend knows about, maybe more. Since this food issue is a relatively new development, I have to wonder if it's something like this, because it sounds very intentional.
My life was on a steady, predictable course that I had carefully built. Growing up in a small town with big dreams, I knew what I wanted: to settle down, raise a family, and work with my hands. Becoming a mechanic felt natural, fueled by my weekends spent in my dad's garage, fixing up old cars. Those moments shaped my future, though the road wasn't always easy. Heather had been central to that dream. She was the girl I admired from afar in high school, someone who seemed untouchable. When we finally got together, I was determined to make it work. We made big plans, buying a house, starting a family. But life had other ideas, and cracks began to show. Now, sitting in my flatbed truck, I stared at the old trailer up ahead. I'd been sitting here for almost 20 minutes, lost in thought. The mailbox still had Prentice on it, but the driveway was empty where my car used to be. If Heather still lived here, she'd be at work. A part of me wondered what car might pull in later. It wouldn't be Drake's. He thought too highly of himself for this side of town. Anger bubbled up, and I almost left. I asked myself again why I took this delivery, coming back after swearing I'd never return. But just as I was about to go, I spotted a swing set and sandbox filled with toys. That hit me hard, and I blinked back tears. Polly would be almost 4 now, my daughter I hadn't seen in years. I remembered the last time I was here, 2 years ago on July 3rd. That day changed everything. Heather and I argued over a party I refused to go to. That fight marked the end of my life as I knew it. I hadn't been back since. We'd been saving for a house in Cayman Estates, dreaming of a perfect future. But we were young and in love, swept up in the fantasy. Heather worked as a receptionist for a construction company, and I was a master mechanic at the Ford dealership. At 24, I was the youngest, but fully trained with a good salary. Together, we saved money every paycheck. Heather had always been popular, cheerleader, majorette, always dating the star athletes. She was beautiful and well-known, always surrounded by attention. I finally met her by chance when she came to buy a car with her dad, Walter MacArthur, a wealthy man in town. Heather was turning 18 and picking out her birthday car. She was stunning, and when she checked out a Mustang convertible, I decided not to miss my chance to say hello. When she looked up, I smiled and asked, "Need any help?" She mistook me for a salesman and pointed to her dad. "He wants me to get a sedan, but I really like this one. How much more is it?" "It's about the same since his choice has all the options. This one's stripped down to lower the price, but it has more power and looks way better. Just tell him the price is the same and see what he says." "What's missing?" she asked. "No power seats, no satellite radio, no leather, and no extra features. But it has what you need. Air, power steering, windows, and locks." She thought for a moment, then walked back to her dad. After talking to him, she returned. "The Focus is more practical, and I like the extras. The convertible's cute, but not for me." I agreed. We chatted, and I introduced myself as a mechanic. She smiled and said her name was Heather. After some more conversation, I asked her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. That started the best summer of my life. We dated throughout the summer and fall. Heather chose to attend a tech school for nursing instead of college, despite her parents' objections. She got her license, checked out hospital jobs, but ended up working fewer hours for better pay at a construction company. After 6 months, she moved into an apartment with a friend, wanting independence. Her dad told me they were disappointed, but Heather insisted they spend money on themselves now. We kept dating, though not exclusively. Heather wasn't ready for a serious commitment and wanted to stay a maid until she found the one. I hoped that would be me, but I didn't push it. Over time, she started seeing other guys less, and I was ready to propose. I made an offer on a double-wide trailer in a nice park just outside of town. Once it was mine, I moved in, planning to surprise Heather with a proposal. That evening, I went to her apartment, only to see her getting out of a car with Drake Cunningham, a coworker from the construction site. I watched from my car as they walked to her door. She had never let me come up after dates, saying her roommate wouldn't like it. At the door, she and Drake exchanged words, and then he pulled her close. I almost jumped out of the car, but waited, when she kissed him back and let his hand roam. I felt sick. I approached them, and when she saw me, she pushed Drake away. I didn't let her speak. I grabbed Drake, punched him in the mouth, and watched him stumble back, bleeding. Heather screamed and rushed to comfort him, cradling his head in her lap. I stood there, furious, watching her comfort Drake as he bled. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the ring box from my pocket and threw it at her. I didn't care about giving it to her anymore. I just needed something to throw. As it bounced off her shoulder, I spat. "I almost made the biggest mistake of my life. I hope you get what you want, but it's not me." On the verge of tears, I ran back to my car, slammed on the gas, and sped away. Back at my trailer, I sat in the dark, overwhelmed by anger and hurt, trying to figure out how I'd been so wrong about her. I thought she loved me like I loved her, but what I saw said otherwise. I finally went to bed around dawn, exhausted, and slept until noon. It was Sunday, and with Heather gone, I had nothing to do. After a shower, I felt some relief, but while standing under the hot water, I suddenly felt her presence behind me. She had slipped into the shower, wrapping her arms around me. I pushed her away, turned off the water, and yelled, "What are you doing? I saw you with Drake. He had his hands all over you, and you didn't stop him." She stood defiant, smiling slightly. "You didn't see everything. I told him it wasn't going to happen between us, and he was angry. I was just trying to get inside to end it when you showed up." "That's a lie," I said. "I saw you kiss him and hold on to him. If you wanted him, you could have just told me. I would have backed off even though it would hurt." "You're wrong, Jesse," she insisted. "You're the only one I want. If I can't convince you with words, then take me now. Make me yours." I hesitated. torn between desire and the memories of her saying she wanted to save herself for marriage. Could I trust her after what I saw? Had my intervention stopped something worse? Or was she telling the truth? I looked at her pleading face and made a decision. I told her I believed her, but I couldn't take her offer, knowing what it meant to her. She smiled and left. That evening, I still planned to propose, though doubts lingered about where she'd spent the night. I silenced them when I arrived at her place. She said yes, and I forgot everything else. We married, she moved into the trailer, and we started saving for a house. Heather got pregnant a year later, and Polly was born 9 months after that. Heather returned to work 6 months later, and we continued saving. I worked overtime whenever I could, and we were finally close to having enough for a down payment. Polly, now 2, needed her own room, and I was excited about our future. We were just waiting for the right house to become available. I was exhausted and didn't have the energy for going out, but I thought Heather understood. We had a few arguments, but she usually backed down, knowing we were saving for our dream home. She occasionally went out with her friends, and while I didn't love it, I couldn't complain since she always came home early. That changed the day before July 4th. After working extra hours, all I wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and to relax with my family for the weekend. When I got home around 4, Heather's car was already there. I grabbed a beer and headed to the deck, ready to unwind. As I relaxed, Heather came out dressed to go out, which surprised me. I also realized Polly wasn't around. "Where's Polly and why are you dressed up?" I asked, not fully processing what was happening. Heather crossed her arms. "Polly's at Mom's for the night. We're going to a party at the park. The company's hosting it for the fireworks. There are seats for employees and their families. We need to hurry." "I told you I wanted to stay home and rest," I replied. "I'm exhausted from working overtime, and I can't stand your work crowd, especially Drake. I never get to go out anymore. You work all the time, and we barely see you. We haven't even been physical engaged in weeks. I want to go out tonight, and I'm going with or without you." "Fine, but I'm not going to that party. We can go to dinner or watch fireworks from the river like we used to." "No, I want to be with my friends tonight, whether you come or not," she shot back. "I'm going. Don't wait up." With that, Heather left, and I stayed behind, angry and frustrated. I wasn't going to chase her, and I wasn't about to spend time with Drake and his crowd. I went inside, had something to eat, but the emptiness I felt wasn't hunger. It was the absence of my wife and daughter. The evening I'd hoped would be relaxing turned into a lonely one. I eventually lay down on the couch and fell asleep. I woke up around 8:30 to fireworks and realized I was still alone. After taking the shower I'd wanted earlier, I decided to head to Towner's Bar and Grill, where I knew Heather would be. The thought of her with Drake made me uneasy, so I felt I had to go. I arrived close to 10 o'clock and ran into Janie and Jake Cummings outside. When I asked if they'd seen Heather, they exchanged nervous glances. Jake warned me that Drake was making a move on her, and she wasn't pushing him away like usual. His guys were keeping her friends at a distance. Inside, I spotted Heather and Drake sitting close together, his hand under the table. Heather looked drunk. I walked up and yelled, "Heather, what are you doing with this guy? Let's go home." Before I could react, 2 men grabbed me and Drake punched me in the face. I saw stars, nearly collapsing as they held me up. Heather just watched, smiling faintly. Fueled by anger, I kicked Drake in the face, but another guy took his place and kept slapping me until I passed out. When I woke up, I was in my car, covered in blood, with bruised ribs and an aching body. A man nearby told me to leave, saying Heather belonged to Drake for the night and threatening me if I returned. Realizing I had no chance, I drove home, showered again, and stared at my battered reflection in the mirror. Sitting in my living room, I reflected on the night. Heather had always agreed to avoid these company parties because of Drake, and she knew I needed rest after all my overtime. But tonight, she went out anyway and sided with Drake. When I came to bring her home, she stood by as I was knocking. My anger grew. I considered getting a weapon or sneaking into Drake's place later, but both options would land me in jail. Neither was worth it. I had no choice but to wait for Heather to come home before deciding my next move. Divorce seemed like the best option, but it had serious downsides. First, I'd be labeled a betrayed and everyone in town would know. Second, with her family's money, I'd risk losing everything, including custody of Polly. I couldn't stay and face that humiliation. Divorce was out, at least for now. As the sun came up, it became clear Heather had spent the night with Drake. No calls, no explanation. There was no doubt what had happened. Worse, no one in town had helped me, proving that Drake had control, and I meant nothing to anyone, including my wife. With that realization, I made my decision. I wouldn't divorce her because that would free her to be with Drake and risk him getting custody of Polly. No, they'd have to live in sin, and Polly would remain my daughter, even if I couldn't see her. I left Heather the money we'd saved for the house, and I planned to send half of my salary monthly to support Polly. This way, Heather could never claim I abandoned them or didn't provide for my child. If she filed for divorce, I'd fight for custody, but in the meantime, I'd do my duty as a father until Polly was grown. An hour later, I left town. My heart was broken and I was hurting, but I couldn't stay and face further humiliation. Heather had made her choice, and now I was making mine, leaving her to explain to our daughter why I wasn't there anymore. After driving all day, I stopped at a motel for the night, then continued the next morning. My body ached and my head pounded, but by the third day, I was 1,000 miles away. In a new town, I found a free clinic and got checked out. I had a mild concussion, cracked ribs, and bruises, but I'd live. I asked the doctor if he knew where a master mechanic could find work, and he referred me to Josh Fields, a custom car dealer. I was lucky to land the job. Josh sold luxury cars and needed someone with my skills to restore and resell them. We hit it off, and he paid me well for my expertise. At the end of that first month, I cashed my check, kept a third, and mailed the rest to Heather, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to me. I repeated this every 2 weeks for the next 2 years, each time sending more money from different locations, making sure I couldn't be found. After the first envelope, which included a note explaining my reasons for leaving and that the money was for Polly, I never added anything else. Just cash. I made it clear that the money was for my daughter's care, ensuring I wasn't abandoning my responsibilities. I found a small, affordable place near work and gradually furnished it with secondhand items. It became a cozy bachelor pad, and I started my new life, determined to change things. I remembered my failure to defend myself that night, so I joined a martial arts class, training hard to ensure I could protect myself next time. I also took the car-related courses Josh recommended, learning that foreign cars were mostly hype, and I often saved Josh money by using equivalent parts. Josh and I became good friends, and he trusted me with deliveries, knowing I could talk to buyers and explain their car's features. Customers liked me, and it helped both Josh and me. Over time, I made new friends and started going out more. One bar I frequented had a group of women who came regularly. After a while, I introduced myself to Sean, a beautiful redhead. We had a lot in common, both dealing with difficult marriages. Her husband had left her, and she was waiting for the legal time to divorce. At first, I told Sean I was separated, but eventually I opened up about Heather and Polly. Sean understood, and she introduced me to her 2-year-old son, Bill. We started dating and things got serious. I was happy with her and her son, enjoying their company and letting the relationship grow naturally. We shared many conversations and soon became physically engaged. Our time together was sweet, and I realized I had never felt this way before, not even with Heather. We spent more time together, and when Billy stayed with friends, Sean would stay over. Those nights were some of the best I'd ever had, filled with love, conversation, and companionship. One day after a night with Sean, I realized just how deeply I cared for her. That's when I realized it was truly over with Heather. A few weeks later, Josh had a Mercedes sedan from Germany that needed delivering. I worked on it, added an air conditioner, tuned the engine, and made sure it was in top condition. Josh asked if I wanted to handle the delivery, a 3-day trip, and I agreed since Sean was visiting her mother for a week. I missed her and Billy, so this seemed like a good distraction, plus there was a bonus. I didn't pay much attention to the destination at first, but when I saw it was my old town, the place I fled from, it hit me. Did I really want to go back? My life was good now with Sean and my job, and I had nearly forgotten the pain Heather caused. But I decided it was time to face it and see my daughter. It was also time to finalize my divorce. I left the next day, uncertain about my emotions. When I arrived, I delivered the car to Carl Cunningham, the owner of the construction company and Drake's father. He didn't know who I was. I pushed down my anger, knowing Carl was probably unaware of what kind of person his son was. Carl's estate was huge, and after I arrived, I backed the car off the flatbed. He inspected it, we took a test drive, and I gave him the paperwork. During the process, he mentioned the car was a gift for Drake, who was trying to impress a woman. He casually mentioned she was married, but her husband had left, and Drake was spending all his time with her. I kept quiet, realizing it was Heather he was talking about. Carl seemed like a decent man, unaware of what his son was up to. He thought Drake was doing right by this woman, not knowing the full story. I nodded along, keeping my thoughts to myself, and we completed the deal. He gave me a cashier's check, and I left. On impulse, I drove to my old neighborhood and parked near my old trailer. I sat there, unsure of what to do next, with a lot on my mind. Now it seemed that with me gone, Drake had finally gotten his way with Heather. Maybe he didn't need to get her drunk after all, and maybe that night wasn't the first time. What I thought was too much drinking could have been her doing what she wanted all along. 2 years later, I sat there, facing my past, trying not to let it overwhelm me. Seeing the swing set and toys brought back painful memories. I had a panic attack, sweating, flushed, and struggling to breathe. I calmed myself with deep breaths and focused on technical thoughts to regain control. Just as I relaxed, her van drove by and pulled into the driveway. It was the same old Toyota with the same license plate. I slumped down in the truck so she wouldn't notice me. Heather got out and walked inside without looking around, seeming in good spirits. I wondered if she was working, though I doubted she needed to, given the money I sent her. A few minutes later, her mother's Mercedes pulled up, and I watched as Grace helped Polly out of the car. My heart ached as I saw my daughter rush inside. I stayed parked for another 20 minutes, watching Polly come out to play on the swing with another little girl. It hit me hard how much I missed her. She had grown so much in the 2 years I'd been gone. Driving away from her again seemed impossible. Tears filled my eyes as I drove to a Motel 6 and checked in with cash, avoiding credit cards that could be traced. I wasn't ready for Drake or anyone to know I was back in town, but maybe that would change. The pain of losing my daughter and my place in her life weighed heavily on me. In the motel room, my humiliation replayed in my mind, fueling my anger. By 10 that night, I couldn't hold back anymore and gave in to the fire burning inside me. I drove to Towner's Bar and Grill, knowing Drake and his crew would likely be there. Spotting them at a table in the back, I felt a surge of anticipation, easing the pain that had been gnawing at me. The bar was quiet, which worked in my favor. I ordered a beer and watched Drake's table through the mirror behind the bar, waiting. Soon, someone pointed me out to Drake, and I saw him glance my way. I smiled, knowing things were about to unfold. My martial arts training had taught me 2 key lessons: patience and how to use anger as a controlled tool. I had been nursing that anger ever since Carl mentioned Drake and Heather. Now it burned white-hot in my chest, fueling my resolve. Drake sent one of his guys over first. The man placed a hand on my shoulder and sneered. "Aren't you the chicken who ran off, leaving your wife and kid? Jesse Chicken Prentice, right?" Without putting down my beer, I turned and smiled. "That's me. What can I do for you?" He laughed and returned to Drake, who stood up and headed my way. I set my beer down and readied myself, feet firmly planted. Position and anticipation were everything in a confrontation, and I was ready. Looking over my shoulder at the bartender, I said, "Make sure you remember who starts this, Jim. I'm not looking for trouble, but I want a witness." Jim nodded. "I hear you, Jesse. Just be careful." "Count on it," I replied, closing my eyes and focusing on my training. My sensei's words echoed in my head. "Don't think, just let your body act." It was time to do just that. There were 4 of them, just like that night when my life changed. My training with my sensei had focused on reactive defense, using the opponent's anger and actions against them. My sensei said I was good at it, and now I had to prove it in the real world. As Drake and his crew approached, I sat quietly at the bar, arms relaxed, my back against the counter. My mind was clear, but my anger burned hot, ready for the moment. Drake stopped just out of reach and sneered, taunting me about Heather. Well, if it isn't the coward who ran off and let me have his wife. She's been mine, Jesse. You weren't here to stop me. I said nothing, watching him, waiting. His words fanned my inner fire, but I stayed in control, focused. One of his men was the only real threat. The others were just background noise. Drake continued. "Why don't you run back to your hole? Heather's with me now, and there's nothing you can do." His words stung, but I realized he might be telling the truth. This was his territory. But I wouldn't let him win. I damped down my anger, knowing it was time to push his buttons. "You're delusional, Drake. Heather always had better taste. She pitied you. Nothing more. You're just a loser who needs backup to get a woman. Do you need your boys to help in bed too?" His face twisted in anger, just as I'd hoped. He grabbed my collar and I let him pull me forward, using the momentum to push him backward. He lost his balance and slammed the floor hard, dazed. His buddies hesitated, unsure of what to do. 2 of them pulled Drake up, his face red with fury. I knew then that the fight was over. I had him. Drake charged at me, arms out, trying to grab me. I sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and yanked him toward the bar. His face slammed into the edge with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the floor in a pool of blood, his nose broken, teeth scattered, and his shoulder likely dislocated. I didn't focus on Drake. I kept my eyes on the others. The man I had been watching cursed and stepped forward, pulling back his arm to throw a punch. He was the one who had threatened me before, the one who laughed about Heather being with Drake. I wasn't just going to stop him, I was going to make sure he paid. He threw a punch, but I dodged, letting him hit nothing. He quickly swung again, and this time I grabbed his arm and twisted, letting my weight pull down. His arm hit the stool, and I heard a loud snap, followed by his scream. His arm had broken below the elbow. As he staggered back, I struck him hard in the chest and followed with a kick to the groin, knocking him out cold. Just to make sure, I kicked him in the head and stomped on his groin a few times. Goodbye to your family, Jules, I thought. My sensei would have been proud, though I resisted the urge to eliminate him. 2 down, 2 left. The others were more cautious now, trying to flank me. They were scared but had no choice but to face me. I closed my eyes, sensing their next move. As they came at me, I grabbed both by the heads and slammed them together. They dropped to the floor, unconscious. With all 4 down, I walked over to Drake and kicked him between the legs, just for good measure. He didn't react, but it felt satisfying. I returned to the bar, took a sip of my beer, and savored the moment. I hadn't even broken a sweat. Jim, the bartender, stared at me in shock. Jesse, I've never seen anything like that. How did you do that? They didn't stand a chance. His words reignited my anger, not toward Drake, but toward the town that stood by and did nothing when I needed help. I turned to Jim, who had watched it all unfold 2 years ago. Just like that night, right, Jim? No one helped me. Not you, not my so-called friends, not even my wife. Well, I'll never let that happen again. Tell everyone to stay away from me unless I allow it, or they'll regret it. Now I'm leaving. Tell the cops what happened and tell the truth, or I'll be back, and you won't like it. Jim muttered, Where are you going, Jesse? What should I tell them? I'll be at the Motel 6. I'm leaving tomorrow at dawn, so if they want to talk, tell them to hurry. With that, I left the bar and returned to the motel. I expected to feel victorious after confronting Drake and his gang, but instead I felt empty. His taunts about Heather still stung, reopening the wounds I thought had healed. My revenge felt hollow, and the pain of Heather's betrayal and losing my daughter flooded back. I sat in the motel room, replaying that night from 2 years ago. Why did I run? I had my reasons, but deep down, I always knew the truth. My marriage was over the moment Heather chose Drake. Still, it didn't ease the pain of losing my daughter. As I sat there, lost in thought, a knock came at the door. Expecting the police, I opened it, but it was Jake Cummings. He had been the one who warned me that night. I nodded and let him in, grateful that at least he had tried to do something. Hello, Jake. Long time no see. How have you and Janie been? We're okay. I figured it didn't hurt to be polite since I was leaving the next morning. Jesse, I heard what you did at Towner's. Jim called and told me everything. Have you been home or seen Heather? She's been losing her mind not knowing where you went. She even hired a PI, but no one could find any trace of you. I just stared at him. Why would I have wanted anyone to know where I was? I made sure no one could find me for a reason, so why tell you now? I shook my head and tried to explain. What did you think, Jake? That I'd stay after what she did with Drake? After he and his guys knocked me up while everyone watched, including Heather? I saw the smile on her face when it happened. I knew then it was over. She and this town can have each other. I came back to do a job, and now I'm leaving, back to where I'm respected. Jake listened and shook his head. I didn't care, but I appreciated that he had tried to warn me that night. Jake, you at least tried to help, and I thank you for that. But now I need you to leave me alone. Jake didn't move. I was getting frustrated, ready to point him to the door, when he sat down and said, No, you're going to hear me out first. Fine, I sighed. Say what you need to, and then go. That night, Janie and I tried to get Heather away from Drake. We had the car ready, but she wouldn't come. She said she'd find you and make Drake let you go. That was the last we saw of her. The next day, we found your trailer empty. We tried to reach Heather all day, and when we finally found her, she was a mess. When she couldn't find you, she became hysterical. We had to take her to the hospital for exhaustion. I was surprised, but still firm in my belief that Heather caused this. She was the one who chose Drake that night. Jake continued. After the hospital, Heather quit her job at the construction company and filed a complaint against Drake. He paid her to drop the charges and stay quiet. She took a job at the hospital and never stopped trying to find you. We all felt guilty for not doing more that night. Jake paused before adding, Heather knows you're back. I told her after Jim called me. She wants to see you but is scared. She knows she messed up and that she's responsible for you leaving and for the knocking you took. She had no intention of staying with Drake. Most of it was bravado. When the fight started, things got out of control, and you were gone before she could do anything. Jake looked uncomfortable as he finished. She never explained where she went that night, and she never admitted to anything. But we chose to believe her, Jesse. We think you should too. He stood up and headed to the door. I don't know what to tell you, Jesse. Heather loves you, and Polly misses you. It's up to you now. I wish you the best. I walked him to the door. I hear you, Jake, and I appreciate it. But she made her choice that night. She knew how I felt about Drake and still went out with him. She defied me and did something no married woman should do. She went to a bar with another man and drank too much. Don't try to make me the bad guy here. Jake looked at me sadly. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. You know her better than anyone. Just be careful and make the right choice for yourself. He left, the door closing with a heavy click in the silence. I sat on the bed, hands in my head, knowing Jake was right, but my anger still burned. I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her, especially not in this town where Drake and his family ruled. Returning here would only bring more trouble, maybe even for me. It was nearly midnight, and I felt restless after the fight. I decided to drive by Cayman Estates, where Heather and I had once dreamed of buying a house. As I drove through the gates, I thought of the plans we had made, decorating a yard for Polly and more kids. All those dreams gone because Heather chose Drake. Tears came as I drove, and I had to pull over until I regained control. The memories of what could have been were painful. This trip hadn't brought closure, just more hurt. I needed to head back to where my real life was now, with Sean and her son, where I had people who cared about me. But I couldn't ignore my love for Polly. I still needed to resolve that, though maybe not tonight. I decided to pack up, leave the motel, and head home. Maybe it was time to file for divorce and let Heather move on with Drake. That thought angered me more. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel. No, this ends now, I muttered. I turned the truck toward Heather's trailer. It was time to confront her and make some decisions. Pulling up down the street, I saw her van parked there. I turned off the engine, ready to end things once and for all. As I stood there, all my old anger and uncertainty came rushing back. I took a few minutes to regain control, berating myself for being weak. Once I felt calmer, I stepped out of the truck and walked to the door, reminding myself this wasn't my home anymore. The porch needed repairs, but that wasn't my responsibility now. Even though I'd worked hard to buy this place for Heather and Polly, because of Heather's choices, it was falling apart. I knocked, and when the door opened, it wasn't Heather. It was her mother, Grace. I was surprised, as her car wasn't there. "Jesse, is that really you?" she gasped. "Come in. Where have you been? What happened?" Before I could react, Grace pulled me inside. I followed her into the small living room, which I had once been proud of. She motioned for me to sit, and I complied, still processing her presence. Grace never liked me, always thinking Heather married beneath her. Yet here she was, acting glad to see me. "Where's Polly?" I asked. "Is Heather out with Drake? Heard he had an accident." I couldn't help but snicker, recalling Drake's run-in with the bar. Grace blushed, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to see my daughter and sort things out with Heather. Grace explained, "Heather's out, asked me to watch Polly. She'll be back around midnight." I sarcastically replied, "I'm sure Drake's taking good care of her. Heather chose him over me, right? So you must be pleased." Grace's face tightened with anger, but I didn't care. I decided to finish up, see Polly, and leave. Heather had moved on. It was time to make things official. I walked down the hall to Polly's room. She was asleep, holding a blue bunny, her hair spread on the pillow. My heart ached seeing her, and I felt tears well up. I stood there, lost in the moment, until Grace came up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "She's missed you, Jesse, almost as much as Heather. You broke their hearts when you left." I turned to look at Grace, who seemed determined to say more. "Come back to the living room and hear me out," she said. "If you leave after, that's your choice. But if you don't listen, you'll just prove me right about you." I gave Polly one last look and followed her down the hall. I entered the room and sat in the chair I used to watch TV in, ready to listen to Grace. I didn't care about her opinion, never had. I figured she wanted to blame me for everything, so I leaned back and nodded. "Go ahead, Grace. You can blame me all you want. I never cared what you thought." Grace frowned, but started speaking. "I need to tell you what happened that night and after. You left, and you have no idea what Heather and Polly went through. I'll tell you the truth. I never thought you were right for Heather. I believed she'd choose someone like Drake, rich and from an important family. But she always said she'd rather die than be with someone like him. I laughed. Drake didn't want to marry her. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped back. Typical language from you, Jesse. I didn't respect you. I thought you were beneath her. But after she married you and had Polly, I saw she was happy. I started to think I was wrong about you. She continued, her voice softening. Then you left her and Polly. I was furious. Heather was devastated, but she wouldn't let me blame you. She even snapped at me whenever I talked badly about you. I didn't understand it. I was getting impatient. No surprise there, Grace. Heather didn't let you badmouth me, and you didn't know why. Grace cut me off with a wave of her hand, her eyes flashing with anger. Heather told me the truth. She explained how you stood up to Drake and how his friends jumped you after you punched him in self-defense. Later, I heard from one of Drake's buddies that they threatened to eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking Heather. I was surprised she knew that much. I hadn't thought anyone knew what was said in the parking lot, but it didn't change what happened. So, you know, Heather caused all this by her actions. She chose to party instead of staying loyal to me. When I left, I believed she was with Drake, and I couldn't stay here if that was true. No one saw her that night, and she didn't come home until the afternoon the next day. Where was she? Did she ever tell you? Grace seemed shocked and shook her head, clearly not knowing. Well, now you know. She went out without me, drank too much, and ended up at the bar with Drake. When I confronted her, she laughed at me. I could have handled the knocking, but the humiliation of what was going to happen was too much. I believe she spent the night with him. This reminded me of the time I proposed to Heather, and I suddenly realized it was the same situation. She probably spent the night with Drake back then, too, only to come back to me, acting innocent. Grace needed to know that part of the story as well. As I sat down in the old chair I used to relax in, I prepared myself to hear Grace out. I didn't care much about what she thought of me, but I was ready to listen, knowing she'd want to blame me. Go ahead, Grace, say what you need to. I know you never thought I was good enough for Heather. Grace frowned, but began. I need to tell you what happened that night and afterward. You left, and Heather and Polly went through a lot. You have no idea. I never thought you were right for her. I always believed she'd marry someone like Drake, wealthy, well-connected. But Heather always rejected him. She told me she'd rather die than marry him. I laughed. Drake didn't want to marry her. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped. You always disrespect her. I never respected you either. But after you two married and had Polly, I saw how happy Heather was. I started to think maybe I was wrong. Her tone softened as she continued. Then you left, and I was furious with you. But Heather wouldn't let me speak badly of you. She was heartbroken. I didn't understand it. I was getting impatient, but Grace pressed on. Heather told me the truth later. She explained how you stood up to Drake that night and only punched him in self-defense. Then, his friends attacked you. After you were knocking, they threatened you in the parking lot, saying they'd eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking Heather. I was surprised she knew the details, but didn't let it change my perspective. So, you know, Heather brought all this on herself. She went out without me, drank too much, and ended up with Drake. When I saw her laughing at me that night, it was clear she had made her choice. I left because I believed she spent the night with him. Grace looked startled and shook her head, seemingly unsure of what had happened that night. Well, now you know. Heather chose to be with Drake. She humiliated me, and I couldn't stay here. I believe she stayed with him that night. And this wasn't the first time. I then recounted the night I proposed, realizing Heather may have already been involved with Drake even then. Grace, calmer now, said, You're wrong. Heather told me she never liked Drake. He always chased her, but she never wanted him. She even asked his dad to make him stop. She loves you, Jesse. She's unhappy now, and the only thing she cares about is Polly. She goes out with her friends occasionally, but she always comes home early. She's been saving every penny you send for Polly's future and hasn't touched any of the money you two saved. Grace stood, grabbing her purse. I'm leaving now, Jesse. You'll have to stay with Polly until Heather returns. I'll take the van and she'll bring it back tomorrow. The van's in bad shape without you to keep it running. Good night, Jesse. Before I could respond, she left, leaving me no choice but to wait for Heather. As I sat there, I thought about what Grace said. It didn't add up. I knew the van had been in perfect condition when I left, and Heather didn't need to work. What I sent her was more than enough to live on. If she had money, why hadn't she bought a new car? It was hard to believe she wasn't going out and partying like before. Grace didn't know everything, and Heather had been good at fooling her mother in the past. I tried to figure out how I wanted to confront Heather. Needing a distraction, I went to check on Polly again. She was still peacefully asleep, and I felt a wave of emotion seeing her. I stayed by her side until the clock struck 1. Heather still hadn't come home, which didn't surprise me. I assumed she was with Drake, probably at the hospital after the bar fight. Just as I was debating getting something to eat, I heard a car pull up. It was Grace's car, followed by an older Mercedes, the same one I had delivered earlier to Drake's father. Heather got out of Grace's car, and a man from the Mercedes handed her something, probably the keys. He then walked back to the waiting car, and Heather waved as it drove off. As Heather came in, I could see she had changed. She was slimmer, her hair longer and shinier, and she wore a much shorter, tighter dress than she used to. Her face had the starry-eyed look she always got after a night of drinking and dancing. This wasn't the sad, unhappy woman Grace had described. "Hello, Jessie. It's been a long time. How are you?" she said softly, a tone I didn't recognize. I wasn't sure what to say. This was a different Heather, more like the one I knew before we got married. I had to be careful. "Hello, Heather. I'm fine. It's been over 2 years since I was here last, the night you went out partying without me. I'm sure you remember." She sat on the couch, took off her coat, and looked at me. "Yes, Jessie. I remember that night. I can't forget it. I see you in my mind getting dragged outside. That's all I remember before Jake and Janie pulled me out the back door." That was the first lie. I knew now how she was going to play this, so I decided to push her a little. "They knocked me pretty badly that night, Heather. A concussion, broken ribs, and bruises. And after they knocked me out, they told me, 'Your wife belongs to Drake tonight. You'll get her back tomorrow.' They said if I tried to get you, they'd drive me into the lake. That's what happened, Heather." I watched her, but she didn't react. "I wasn't going to die for you, since you'd chosen Drake. So I went home and waited. You never came back. Never called, not a word. By morning, I realized you'd been with him all night, and I couldn't live with that shame. So I left." Tears welled in her eyes as she listened, but when she broke down crying, I could see they weren't real. Her eyes still held contempt. "Nothing happened, Jessie. I was with Jake and Janie the whole time. I tried to call you but couldn't get through. By the time they brought me back to the trailer, you were gone." I shook my head. "Why would you expect me to stay? You went to that bar with Drake, sat with him, and let him touch you. You smiled when you saw me." It was a smile of satisfaction. "I waited all night for you, Heather. You never called, and Jake told me you didn't leave with them. They didn't see you again until the next day. You're lying." She looked away, trembling, but I continued. "As I waited in the trailer that night, I remembered the time I was going to propose to you. You were with Drake then, too, and I trusted you when you said nothing happened. But now I see I was a fool to believe you. That's why I left." "Oh, God, Jessie," she whispered. "I was the fool. That night at the apartment, I was telling the truth. The only mistake I made was teasing Drake by saying I loved you. I wasn't going to let him into my apartment. I let him touch me earlier to make him less suspicious, but I was trying to keep him out. When you showed up, that's what you saw. I swear I was telling the truth." Heather took a deep breath and continued. "That night of the party, I messed up. I was angry and wanted to hurt you, but not by doing anything with Drake, just by making you jealous. I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy, and I knew what I was doing. When I smiled, it was because I was happy you finally came for me. But when Drake got up and rushed at you, I realized everything was going wrong. That wasn't what I planned. I was so shocked I just sat there, and before I knew it, everything went to hell. The next thing I remember, I was at my parents' house. The next morning, I understood what I had done. You were gone, and I realized what you must have thought." She wiped her eyes, sniffling. "I knew I had driven you away, and I couldn't find you. Polly cried herself to sleep for weeks, and I had no way to comfort her. I couldn't tell her I drove you away. I never stopped loving you, Jessie, and I haven't been with anyone else since you left. All the money you sent has been saved for Polly. I've lived here waiting for you to come back. Now that you're here, I've said everything. It's up to you now. All I want is your forgiveness and for you to come back to me and our daughter." I sat in disbelief at the lies she told so easily. Heather had spent the night with Drake at least twice that I knew of. Once when I almost proposed, and the night of the party. Likely more. She was always good at lying, and tonight was no different. She crafted her story to fit what she wanted me to believe. Heather had made her choices, going out without me, sitting with Drake, drinking too much, and expecting me to come rescue her without consequences. When things spiraled out of control, she spent the night with Drake. She always had feelings for him, but chose me because she knew Drake wasn't husband material. When things got boring, she found a way to have both. She caused my knocking and my decision to leave, but hadn't she paid a price? I moved on, found a new life, good friends, and even a potential new relationship with Sean. Meanwhile, Heather had the chance to tell me the truth tonight and instead lied. Her regrets felt hollow. There was no chance I'd go back to her. I made up my mind. Heather, that car you came home in, it's Drake's old car. He gave it to you. The other car in the driveway is the one I delivered to Drake's father this morning. His dad told me Drake is with a woman whose husband ran off after cheating. Her eyes widened as she started to speak, but I silenced her. You were with Drake the night I almost proposed. And again at the party. Even your mother didn't know where you were that night. She believes your lies, just like everyone else. You claim you tried to reach me, but my phone never rang. Why lie, Heather? Let's be real. I made a mistake marrying you, but I'm over it. Once a cheater, always a cheater, right? Heather's tears were real this time as I confronted her with her lies. I saw shock turn into fear and finally into genuine pain. She knew it was truly over. Why are you crying, Heather? You ended things the night you cheated on me in front of everyone. You had to know that. Before, you hid it, and I either didn't notice or refused to believe it. But that night, you made it public. You knew I'd never accept you with Drake. Or any other man. I'm sorry, Jesse. I was angry, had too much to drink, and made a stupid mistake. Drake means nothing to me. You're the only man I've ever loved. Please forgive me. No, Heather, I don't owe you forgiveness. It wasn't just a mistake, and it wasn't the first time you were with him, even before we were married. Now, I don't even know if Polly is mine. Your lies and deceit are too much. She sobbed harder. No, Jesse, Polly is yours. I don't love Drake, and I'm not with him. He just gave me the car to help us. I've never been with him. You're wrong. I shook my head. I'm not wrong, Heather. You've lied to everyone, including your mother, Jake, and Janie. I believed you back then, but that was my mistake. You were always drawn to parties, and Drake had money. You spent the night with him when I was going to propose and came back pretending nothing happened. I was blind because I loved you. Her tears flowed, but I felt no sympathy. But I see through it now. You've cheated on me and I'm done. Tomorrow I'll be gone and I'll file for divorce as soon as I get back. I stared into her eyes. And I'll get a DNA test to make sure Polly is mine. If it's not, I'll sue you for fraud. Heather's face paled as she whispered, Why, Jesse, why would you think that? I've waited for you all this time, raising our daughter, saving everything you sent. Do you think I've been lying? Yes, Heather, I do. You've always lied. If you cared, you wouldn't have gone behind my back with Drake. It's too late now. I stood, ready to leave. You can keep everything. The money, the trailer. I just want to forget it all, but I'll demand time with Polly. If you fight that, I'll take you and Drake down. I'll agree to child support, but not alimony. I won't give you a dime for him. You can call me when you're ready for me to take Polly. She'll just hold you back. As I turned to leave, I heard a small voice. Daddy, is that you? I looked down and saw Polly, her wide eyes staring at me. My heart sank. Yes, baby. It's Daddy. Hi, Daddy. Are you going to come home and live with us again? I hesitated, looking at her and Heather. No, Pumpkin. I'm leaving tomorrow. But I'll visit you as often as I can, okay? Tears filled her eyes. Why can't you stay, Daddy? I knelt down. Mommy and I aren't going to be together anymore, but I'll still see you, I promise. Heather, now composed, added, That's right, sweetie. Daddy will visit you often. As I held back my emotions, I felt a tug of old affection. I hugged Heather one last time, her fragile frame clinging to me. She whispered, I'm so sorry, Jesse. Can you ever forgive me? I pulled back. No, Heather. I'll never forgive you for destroying my relationship with Polly. I'll stay civil, but when she's old enough, I'll make sure she knows the truth about you. Her face reflected the horror of my words, but I forced a smile. Take care of her. I'll send everything soon. Once I loved you with everything I had, but now it's too late. Heather sobbed. I don't know how I'll survive without you. I believed you'd come back. I never stopped loving you. I sighed. I don't care anymore. As for Polly, I love her, but I need proof she's mine. Maybe you'll let her visit me. She'll like Sean and Billy. They're waiting for me now. I kissed Polly's forehead, gave Heather one last look, and walked out. In my car, I stopped the recording on my phone and sent it to her mother and Jake. So much for lies. As I drove away, I saw Heather watching from the doorway. I waved goodbye, my only thought, Sean, I'm coming home.
Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mike parked the car in front of the house with a smile on his face. He held a bouquet of white lilies, Rachel's favorite, and felt a simple but profound satisfaction in surprising her. Leaving work early was rare for him, but that week, he had noticed the growing distance between them, each stuck in their routines. Determined to rekindle the connection that brought them together, he planned a special dinner, one he would prepare himself, knowing it was something Rachel would love. As he walked toward the door, the sky was already darkening, and the porch lights cast a warm glow. The moment he stepped inside, silence greeted him, but one thing caught his attention: the music. It was a soft melody, muffled, as if coming from another floor. Mike's heart quickened, not with worry but with curiosity. Rachel often played music when she was relaxing, reading a book, or tidying up the house. He imagined finding her on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a glass of wine in hand. "Rachel," he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the distant music. He placed the flowers on the living room table and began climbing the stairs, paying attention to every detail. The familiar lavender scent from a diffuser lingered in the hallway, but something felt different. There was an energy in the air, something he couldn't immediately identify. The upstairs lights were on, casting shadows through the door frames, and his steps slowed. He climbed each step carefully, as though he didn't want the sound of his shoes to disrupt the mystery of the moment. Reaching the top of the stairs, he paused, tilting his head to listen more closely. The music came from the bedroom, but now he could hear something else: a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for him to recognize that it was Rachel. She was talking. He couldn't make out every word, but her tone seemed animated, almost nervous. A sinking feeling began to form in his chest, as if his instincts were warning him about something his mind had yet to grasp. Mike walked down the hallway, his breathing heavier. He passed the photos on the wall, pictures from trips and happy moments that felt both recent and distant. As he neared the bedroom door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. The warm yellow light spilled through the crack, drawing a bright line on the hallway floor. He stopped, hesitating for a moment. Was he being irrational to think something was wrong? Maybe she was just on the phone with her mom or dealing with something trivial. But the feeling wouldn't leave him, as if something unseen was pulling him into that room, insisting he needed to know what was happening. Rachel's laughter hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't her usual laugh, the kind he knew from when she watched comedies or recalled something funny. This was different. Nervous. Forced, even. He leaned closer, and now her words were clearer. "You're not afraid he'll catch us?" Rachel said, her voice carrying a tone he couldn't quite place. Mike's heart raced in a way he hadn't felt since his high school football days. Heat rose to his neck while a chill ran down his spine. He steadied himself against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm down. He didn't want to rush in and create a scene, but every fiber of his being screamed for answers. Her words echoed in his mind, every syllable a riddle he needed to solve. Who was she talking to? Why did she sound so uneasy, so different? He knew he was about to face something that would change the course of the night. Mike stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what he'd just heard. His thoughts raced in every direction, each one more chaotic than the last. Anxiety weighed heavily on him, but something kept him rooted in place, as if bracing himself for what was to come. His breathing was labored, and the silence of the hallway made each heartbeat pound loudly in his ears. Inside the room, the conversation continued, and Rachel sounded more at ease than he had expected. She laughed again, but it wasn't the laugh he knew, one of comfort or affection. This was different, almost conspiratorial. He tried to push away the thoughts gnawing at him, but the next words he heard hit him like a blow to the stomach. "No, he never gets home at this hour. It's fine." Every word felt like a dark puzzle piece falling into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. Mike felt anger mix with sadness, creating an overwhelming and confusing sensation. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for clarity amidst the turmoil in his mind. Am I overreacting? He wondered, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe this is nothing, maybe, but her words kept replaying in his mind, refusing to grant him relief. He knew this wasn't paranoia. The situation was too strange to be a coincidence. Determined, Mike took a step forward, the creak of the floorboard sounding as loud as thunder. He froze, waiting for a reaction, but Rachel didn't notice. She was distracted, engrossed in the conversation, her words flowing like a current he could barely follow. You're overthinking. He doesn't suspect a thing. That sentence made Mike's blood run cold. Suspect what? He thought. What is she talking about? It was as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished, and he was on the brink of falling into an abyss he never knew existed. The anger surged within him, but something stronger held him back, the need to know the whole truth before confronting her. Time seemed to crawl as he stood there, catching snippets of the conversation, trying to piece it together. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed increasingly comfortable. There was something in her tone that disturbed him deeply, a confidence that he would never find out what was going on. Mike clenched his fists, feeling the tension rise through his arms. He wanted to burst through the door at that very moment, but he knew he needed more. The last thing he wanted was to explode without being absolutely certain of what he was facing. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the feeling of betrayal consumed him with every passing second. From the other side of the door, Rachel laughed again. Yes, tomorrow is perfect. Same time works for me. That sentence was the final straw. Mike felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. There was no room for doubt or hesitation anymore. Without thinking, he pushed the door open with force. The sound of the door slamming against the wall made Rachel jump, her phone falling to the floor. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Mike standing there, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the vibrating phone on the floor. The message on the screen shone like a silent accusation, tomorrow, same time? The silence that followed felt endless. Mike stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Rachel, who was as still as a statue. The surprise on her face quickly turned to panic, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for the phone still buzzing on the floor. But Mike was faster. He stepped forward, picked up the device, and held it firmly, as though it was his only anchor to the truth he now had to face. Rachel took a step back, her voice shaking as she tried to fill the suffocating space between them. Mike, it's not what you think. I can explain, she said, but the hesitation in her tone betrayed her. Mike didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the phone screen, on the message that screamed the answers he didn't want to know. Tomorrow, same time. Each word felt like a dagger to his chest. He raised his eyes, his expression filled with pain but also with a controlled anger that gave weight to his words. Then tell me, Rachel, what exactly am I thinking? Because right now, none of this makes sense to me. Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with tears she tried to hold back but couldn't. She knew she was cornered, and any attempt to deny it would be futile. Instead, she covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. I was just talking to someone, she began, her words coming out in disjointed fragments. It's just my personal trainer. We met a few times, but that's all, Mike. I swear. Her explanation sounded like a desperate attempt to downplay what he already knew. Mike felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe her, wanted so badly for this to be a misunderstanding, but the pieces of the conversation he had overheard left no room for doubt. Talking, he said, his voice firm but emotional. Rachel, I heard you. I heard you say I never suspect anything. That I never come home at this hour. Do you think that sounds like just talking? Rachel tried to move closer to him, but Mike stepped back, raising a hand as if constructing an invisible barrier between them. He didn't want her to touch him, not while the crushing sense of betrayal still weighed heavily on him. Please, Mike. I made a mistake. But it's not what you think. Nothing happened, she pleaded, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Mike couldn't ignore. He held the phone up in front of her face, the screen still displaying the message. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe a spark of truth, that might convince him not to walk away. Tomorrow, same time, he repeated slowly, almost in a whisper. Does that sound like nothing to you? Rachel broke down. Tears now flowed freely as she sank onto the bed, covering her face with her hands. I don't know why I did it. It was just talking, attention, something I felt I was missing, but I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to go any further. Her words cut deep. Mike felt the weight of her revelation settle heavily on his shoulders, crushing him. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask why he hadn't been enough for her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he took a step back, the phone still in his hand, as he looked at Rachel like she was a stranger. You didn't want to hurt me, he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rachel, you've destroyed everything. Everything we had. She looked up, her eyes swollen with tears, but before she could say anything, he turned away. Mike felt as though the ground was disappearing beneath him, but he knew he couldn't stay in that room a second longer. He left without looking back, the phone still buzzing in his hand, a constant reminder of what he had just lost. Mike walked down the stairs with firm steps, but his heart felt like it was stumbling with every beat. Everything around him, the objects, the corners of the house he shared with Rachel, now seemed like cruel reminders of what they had and what he felt he was losing at that moment. He still held the phone, not knowing why he couldn't let it go. Maybe because it now symbolized the truth he didn't want to face but had no choice but to accept. Reaching the living room, he stopped by the table where he had left the bouquet of white lilies. They were still there, so fresh, so pure, so disconnected from the reality that now consumed him. He looked at the flowers for a moment, and the irony of the situation hit him hard. The intention behind them now seemed naive, out of place amidst the pain that filled him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but everything around him seemed to spin. Rachel's muffled sobs from upstairs echoed in the house, a constant reminder of what he had just witnessed. The phone vibrated again in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, and a mix of anger and curiosity overwhelmed him. This time, it was a different message. It didn't have the same casual tone he had read earlier. Are you okay? Did he suspect anything? The message read. Mike's breathing quickened, and heat surged through his body like a wave. The confirmation was there. It wasn't just innocent chatting, it wasn't just a distraction. It was something planned, something kept hidden. He knew he should drop the phone, should just walk away, but he couldn't resist. A mix of a need for understanding and a desire for answers drove him to open the previous messages. As he read, the weight of the betrayal grew heavier. The exchanges were filled with insinuations and subtle planning, things Rachel had never shared with him. Pieces of a secret world she had built away from his sight. Each message felt like it tore away a piece of his trust, leaving him emptier each time. He read until he couldn't anymore. Not because he had reached the end, but because he felt that if he continued, something inside him would break irreparably. He closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, trying to decide what to do next. He couldn't go back up there to confront her again. What more was there to say? Her words had already been lost in the void between them. Mike placed the phone on the table next to the flowers, as if leaving behind the symbol of everything he had uncovered. But before he could take the next step, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Rachel was there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red but filled with an expression that mixed desperation and hope. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mike raised his hand, signaling for silence. "No. Not now." His voice was low but firm, each word carrying a weight he could no longer bear. Rachel shook her head, struggling to hold back more tears. "Mike, please. I know I made a mistake, but, please listen to me. I don't want to lose you." He looked at her, and for a brief moment, he almost gave in. There was so much love mixed with the pain he felt, so much of their history still alive in his heart. But then, the image of the message flashing on the phone returned to his mind, along with the certainty that something had changed forever. He stepped back, breaking the physical contact between them, and Rachel seemed to shrink under the weight of his rejection. "Rachel, I don't know what you expect me to say. You've destroyed something I never thought could be broken." He paused, looking at her, searching for any sign that she understood the depth of the damage. "I just need time. Space to breathe. Because right now, all I see is this. You and this." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his car keys from the entryway table and walked out the door. The cool night air enveloped him but brought no relief. He got into the car but didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to find some sense amid the chaos of his night. The silence in the car was almost comforting, but he knew the quiet outside couldn't drown out the storm raging inside him. Mike sat in the car, the sound of the keys dangling against the dashboard swaying slightly with his breathing. The silence outside was nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional wind rustling through the trees on the street. He stared at the steering wheel, at the distorted reflection of his trembling hands in the leather's sheen. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there since leaving the house. It could have been minutes or hours, time seemed meaningless at that point. His mind spun, replaying every moment of the night. The message, Rachel's words, the desperation in her face. He tried, somehow, to rearrange it all into something that made sense, but it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with mismatched parts. He thought he knew Rachel, or at least he had known her until tonight. But now, as he revisited the past few months, the memories took on a different tone. Small gestures, trivial excuses, quickly deleted messages on her phone. Things that once seemed insignificant now stood out as signs of something larger he had overlooked. He closed his eyes, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to push away those images. But even in the darkness of his mind, the message on the phone burned like an invisible scar. He wondered how it had come to this. Was there something he could have done? Had he been neglectful, distracted, or simply not enough? These questions circled in his mind, each one more cruel than the last. And deep down, he knew he wouldn't find the answers now. A notification sound from his own phone pulled him out of his thoughts. He picked it up hesitantly, almost afraid of what it might be. It was a message from a close friend, Mark, someone who had always been like a brother to him. "Hey, are you okay? You seemed off at work today." Mike stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. Mark was the one person he felt could understand, but how could he explain something he himself still couldn't comprehend? He placed the phone back on the seat beside him, deciding now wasn't the time to respond. He knew he couldn't sit there forever. What he truly needed was a space free of the night's memories or Rachel's lingering presence. So, without thinking too much, he started the car and began driving. He didn't have a destination, he just drove, guided by a need for movement, to escape something that seemed to relentlessly chase his mind. The streets were deserted, lit by dim streetlights casting distorted shadows on the pavement. He passed familiar places that once brought comfort, the cafe where he and Rachel used to have breakfast on Saturdays, the park where he'd planned to propose but got too nervous and ended up doing it in the car. Now, each spot felt loaded with painful irony, as if the universe were mocking him. Eventually, he found himself parked in front of a closed gym. The glass facade reflected the streetlights, and through the darkness, he could see the neatly arranged equipment, the stationary treadmills, the orderly weights. The sight was ordinary but carried significance. It was there that Rachel had first mentioned her personal trainer. Mike had never paid attention. He trusted her, he always had. He thought about going in, maybe confronting whoever the man was. But the idea felt absurd and desperate. What would he gain from it? More empty words? More excuses that would only deepen the pain? He shook his head, muttering to himself, "This won't change anything." The exhaustion finally caught up to him. He felt the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders, consuming whatever energy he had left. He was tired, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. Yet he knew this was only the first of many nights he would have to face the reality of what had happened. Resting his head against the steering wheel, he allowed himself, for the first time, to feel the full depth of the emptiness inside him. Mike stayed with his forehead against the steering wheel. The emotional exhaustion seemed to drain whatever strength he had left. The memories, the thoughts, and the doubts whirled in his mind like an uncontrollable storm, and he realized he needed a starting point, something to help him begin to reorganize his life after that night. Finally, he lifted his head and looked up at the sky through the windshield. The stars were scattered, shining with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos within him. For a moment, he wondered how the world could appear so peaceful while his life seemed to be falling apart. He took a deep breath, trying to draw some of that serenity into himself. Suddenly, something within him began to shift. Maybe it was the exhaustion reaching a critical point, or maybe it was the instinct for emotional survival. But he felt a spark of clarity amidst the turmoil. He realized that no matter how crushing Rachel's betrayal was, he still had control over one thing: how he chose to respond from that moment forward. The pain was there, raw and overwhelming, but he knew he didn't want to be defined by it. He wanted something more for himself, something beyond the suffering. Mike started driving again, this time with more purpose. He decided he needed a place where he could think, where he could feel everything he needed to without interruption. He arrived at a park he used to visit in the early years of his marriage. It was late, and the place was deserted. He parked the car and got out, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He walked to a bench near a small lake, where the water reflected the starlight. There, sitting under the open sky, he finally allowed the tears to fall freely. As painful as it was, he knew he needed to let it out. He cried for everything: for the betrayal, the loss of trust, the years he had invested in a marriage that now felt so fragile. But as the tears fell, he felt something else. A weight began to lift, as though each tear carried away a fragment of the pain. He knew it wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but there, on that lonely bench, he took the first step toward healing. While sitting there, surrounded by the night's silence, he began to reflect on what he truly wanted for his future. He knew he couldn't go back in time or undo what Rachel had done. But he also knew he didn't have to carry that burden alone. He thought of Mark, of his earlier message, and realized it might be time to open up to someone. Mark was more than a friend, he was someone Mike knew he could trust. He picked up his phone and typed a short message: "You were right. I'm not okay. Can we talk?" He sent it before he could hesitate, and the simple act of pressing send felt like a release. He didn't know what to expect from the conversation, but he knew he had to start rebuilding himself, even if it was one small step at a time. As he waited for a reply, he looked out at the lake and began to remember who he was before Rachel, before the marriage. He thought about the dreams he had, the things he loved to do but had set aside over the years. There was a life there, one he could reclaim, or even reinvent. For the first time that night, he felt something close to hope. It wasn't big or strong, but it was there, a spark ready to grow. The phone vibrated in his hand, and a message from Mark appeared: "Of course. I'm here for you. Do you want to talk now or tomorrow?" Mike smiled faintly, feeling a little less alone. He replied, "Tomorrow, thanks. I need to sort out my thoughts." As he put the phone away, he realized that this decision, small as it was a step toward who he wanted to be, someone who, despite the pain, chose to move forward. That night, Mike returned to the car and drove, not to the house he shared with Rachel but to his parents' home, where he knew he would find comfort. He knew the journey ahead would be long, filled with ups and downs, but for the first time since opening that door and watching his world collapse, he felt he could find himself again. The betrayal would not be the end of his story but the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would choose his own path without looking back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.
My cheated wife's affair exposed at work, office collapse, his wife shocked, I got revenge. I am a 37-year-old man who has been married to Judy, a 32-year-old woman, for 2.5 years. It's tough to pinpoint a single moment that defines everything that has happened so far, but I believe things took a turn for the worse after that annoying phone call. I was in the living room watching football highlights I missed from the previous day when my wife's phone began to ring. Annoyed by the ringing phone disrupting the game commentary, I brought it to her in the kitchen and asked her to handle the call. Then the phone rang again, and she seemed ready to confront the caller. Since both of us worked in the corporate world, Judy had a rule of not letting work intrude on our home life. She thought it was important to separate our professional and personal lives. She maintained her privacy and encouraged me to do the same. She never answered work-related calls on weekends and preferred to handle urgent matters via email. I walked towards the kitchen exit, half expecting her to explode, but it didn't happen. She fell silent, and her expression changed. It wasn't until dinner that she revealed what the phone call was about. "They're transferring us out of state," she said. "Transfer? Why? Where?" I inquired. As soon as those words left my mouth, I realized the situation. I had previously mentioned the company's expansion. Apparently, the board wanted to relocate employees to oversee the branch's development, she explained. I understood how transfers worked, but they typically didn't transfer married individuals without their consent. Judy hadn't requested the transfer. I suggested she decline it, but she explained that it came with a promotion, the one she had been working towards her entire career. It was becoming clear what the situation was. Judy was an ambitious woman, and I admired that about her. For the past year, she had put in a lot of effort to earn that promotion. She volunteered, worked extra hours, and made sure her team of 7 functioned smoothly. Now it was about to pay off, though not in the way we expected. Her salary would double, with numerous perks and benefits, but it was never just about the money for her. She was determined to climb the corporate ladder. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. All I could say was, "It's not your fault, but it puts me in a difficult situation." I had 2 clear options. I could advise her to turn down the transfer, sacrificing the promotion, or I could be supportive and give her my blessing to pursue the opportunity she had worked so hard for. In my mind, I considered that long-distance marriages could work. I hadn't seen many examples, but they must exist, right? I was hopeful, but not wanting to hold her back, I told her, "I'll support your decision, whichever way you choose. We can make it work." Now I deeply regret those words. She was thrilled, and in that moment, I believed I had made the right choice. I convinced myself that people maintained their marriages during long business trips, spending months away from their families and still keeping the spark alive. Looking back, she didn't give me much room to refuse. If I had given my honest opinion and asked her not to take the job, she would have considered it, but it would have come at a cost, potentially leading to the collapse of our marriage. I didn't want that. I also disliked the idea of her being so far away, but if our marriage was on the line, the lesser evil was letting her go. It seemed like the only logical choice. Faced with a similar situation again, I'm not sure I would choose differently. She spent the evening thanking me for being understanding, but I couldn't shake the irritation I felt. I realized that my wife had manipulated me into making a decision in her favor. She had baited me. I was certain. However, she seemed genuinely excited. After all the travel arrangements were made, we had a long discussion about how to make the marriage work. Naturally, we decided to call each other every day to stay involved in our daily lives. The thought of infidelity never crossed my mind because I believed Judy was too focused on her goals to consider it. Her company agreed to give her 5 days off each month. "It'll work," she assured me just before boarding the plane. Little did I know, my marriage had ended at that moment. All long-distance relationships start the same way, with constant calls. I even got her a Bluetooth earpiece so we could talk while she worked. For the first 2 months, it seemed to be working. We were on the phone more, and I learned more about her life than I did when we lived together. Suddenly, it felt like I had made the right choice by prioritizing her ambition over my needs. I thought we were in a good place, at least until 2 months ago. Judy phoned one morning to cancel her trip back to Michigan. Her company's performance for the last 3 months was not good, and she needed to find more skilled people for administrative roles to make her job easier. I was fine with it, as I was on the cusp of sealing a major deal that would give me more flexibility in my work. The payout for closing the deal was worth millions, and it would allow me to spend more time with my wife. Waiting for 5 days to surprise her seemed insignificant compared to the time I could have with her. I kept the deal secret to give her a pleasant surprise, so I needed to stay focused and avoid distractions. We didn't call each other during this time, which was the longest we had gone without talking on the phone. We exchanged texts on WhatsApp, but we were both too busy for meaningful conversations. I'm sharing this story because a mutual friend recently accused me of being cold and manipulative after hearing what happened. In my view, I'm neither of those things. If anything, the big deal eventually went through and everything was about to be finalized. This deal was a game changer and would secure my family's financial future. It was with the first client I'd ever closed, making me part of the top 10% wealthiest Americans. That night, while waiting for confirmation, I fought the temptation to call her. I wanted to share the past week's events and how our lives were going to change. Instead, I planned a surprise vacation for us, including tickets, hotel, food, and sightseeing. While scrolling through WhatsApp, I saw her story with a photo of her hugging a man named Henry. He had dark hair, blue eyes, and seemed to be in his mid-30s. He was the first person she hired when she started her job, and he knew the business well. Below the picture, she captioned it as, "Dark times reveal angels." I should have suspected something was amiss and delayed telling her about the deal. I decided to fly to California to see her, and that's when I found out about her affair with Henry. I called her Michigan office to find out her location for a surprise visit, and fortunately, a mutual friend who worked as the receptionist helped keep my arrival a secret. During the flight, I imagined how Judy would react to the news of the deal. I went straight to her branch from the airport, hoping to take her out to dinner to share the news. However, I was told she hadn't shown up for work that day, so I took an Uber to the address I was given, wondering why the receptionist at her branch seemed surprised to learn that Judy was married. I didn't press for details since Judy liked to keep her personal life private. After climbing 4 flights of stairs, I stood at her apartment door with a bouquet of flowers hidden behind my back. Just as I was about to knock, I heard her moan and someone saying, "Keep going." My heart sank. It only took 5.5 months for her to cheat on me. I was consumed by anger, which threatened to overwhelm my rationality, but I made an effort to stay quiet. I left her apartment and drove back to her office to ask the receptionist not to mention my visit, and I gave her a $100 tip. I also stayed in a nearby hotel to keep an eye on her. During the week that followed, I trailed her in a rental car, and she didn't suspect a thing. She followed a pattern between work, yoga, and her apartment, making it easy for me to monitor her movements. This is how I realized she spent a lot of time with Henry, and it wasn't difficult to figure out he was the one she was having an affair with. I tried calling and messaging her during this time, but she used work as an excuse and pleaded for space to sort out her professional life. It was at that moment I decided not to let her manipulate me any longer. I prepared divorce papers and waited for her to return home with Henry. It seemed like they spent most of their time in bed because as soon as I arrived at her door, all I could hear were moans and grunts. I unlocked the door quietly and entered her bedroom, recording with my phone. It was gross to watch, but I recorded a full minute of their night out before revealing myself. At that moment, as she scrambled for clothes, I felt empowered, though it was a sad and painful experience. Her distress when I told her I'd share the video with her colleagues and family, unless she signed divorce papers, justified my actions. She begged for forgiveness, claiming she'd resign and seek therapy, but I was repulsed by her. Who wouldn't be? Every time I saw her, I couldn't shake the image of her with Henry, which made me want to vomit. Her requests were impossible, and I wouldn't entertain them. She said she'd resigned when she dropped off signed divorce papers, but I still sent the video to her parents to show them the child they raised. Regarding some comments, it seemed like she was already out of the relationship when she took the job. She likely wanted this for a while, and may have been cheating on you for some time. She manipulated you into accepting the job, leaving you no real choice. Major, life-changing decisions like that can profoundly affect a family. Now it's been 5 months since the divorce, and I wanted to update you. A while back, my wife moved to another state to oversee her company's new branch and started an affair with a CO worker, which I discovered during a surprise visit. After the divorce, I took some time to regroup and even went on a week-long vacation to the Dominican Republic, a great place, by the way. One evening, I received a Reddit notification about my initial post. When I wrote it, I was mostly venting my anger, frustration, and disgust. Surprisingly, it gained a lot of attention. While reading the comments, one stood out, written by someone who had gone through a similar situation a few years ago. He mentioned feeling miserable for not getting sufficient revenge to satisfy his spirit. It may sound strange and unpopular, as many people seemed content with me simply exposing her infidelity to her parents and getting her fired without going further. It was somewhat satisfying to witness her relationship with her parents fall apart due to that video, but aside from that, it seemed like I hadn't accomplished much. The last I heard, she was staying in a motel and working at a nightclub, which oddly suited her as a cheater. About 3 weeks after I returned from my trip to the Dominican Republic, she showed up at my door begging for my forgiveness and to take her back. It was quite entertaining watching her with puffy, bloodshot eyes from either crying or dealing with some issues. Regardless of the situation, it didn't concern me much. She was already an emotional wreck. My focus shifted to the guy she cheated on me with, Henry. I let her in, and she seemed to think I was reconsidering the divorce because she immediately started explaining her actions, claiming she never thought I'd actually go through with it. She even said she'd lost her parents' respect, and I had already punished her enough. I decided to test her by asking a question I knew she'd fail, but I wanted to be sure she didn't disappoint. When I asked her how many times it happened, she answered 1, swearing it was the truth. It was hard to believe anything she said after that. My dad used to say, it's nearly impossible to look someone in the eye and lie to them, but she proved him wrong. I didn't know exactly how many times they had been together, but I had a rough idea of when it started, and it certainly wasn't a one-time thing. I was skeptical, but if I hadn't followed her around for the first 2 weeks after arriving in Michigan and heard her moaning in her room the day I got there, I might have fallen for her lies. Her desire for a private life no longer mattered. As for Henry, I had discovered he was a married man, which infuriated me. I knew I had a chance to exact revenge on him too. I didn't need a mirror to know my acting skills were far from perfect, but she fell for it. Thinking I was considering reconciliation, I told her to give me time to think, then immediately sent the video to everyone who knew her, including her friend at the office. My first move was booking a ticket to Michigan to expose Henry's married life, using information from Judy. I rented an apartment near his place, keeping an eye on him and waiting to release the videos of his affairs with my ex-wife. Meanwhile, I watched his wife, Amy. She was stunning, with blonde hair, gray eyes, and a captivating smile. My initial plan was to seduce her and gloat to her husband, but my feelings took an unexpected turn. Amy was a kind and genuine person, and we developed a close friendship. I even started seeing less of Henry for a while. I learned that Henry had lost his job and was desperately job hunting to avoid suspicion from Amy. During our conversations, Amy also shared her marital problems, with her husband barely paying attention to her until recently. Unbeknownst to her, this information gave me the ammunition I needed. I revealed the truth to Amy and showed her the video which haunted my dreams. She was easily convinced, and we planned how she would confront Henry. Although I wasn't there to witness it, I made sure he knew I was behind his troubles. The last I heard, he was being deported. Now I can say I feel satisfied. Letters were sent to various people, including family, friends, homemakers, professionals, factory workers, doctors, lawyers, educators, priests, preachers, and even Facebook friends. The common thread among them was their connection to Amy Taylor or Josh Long. The message you're about to read is from Ben Taylor, who's Amy's husband, as well as your daughter, sister, friend, and co-worker. I realize that most of you may not know me, and I appreciate your time. I have some information about my beloved wife and her friend, information that some of you might already be aware of or suspect. I've made the choice to eliminate all uncertainty and share what I know. I'm aware that many of you may not like it, some might even hate it, or even me. However, I'm prepared to face the consequences. Please take a look at the first attachment. There's a picture of Amy and Josh sharing a passionate kiss on the screen. The caption says, "Foreplay." This photo was taken 3 months ago at her company picnic. They believed they were discreet, but my friend, who was searching for his children, witnessed it. He took some pictures and gave them to me, thinking I might need them. That's what a good friend does. I must admit that I became a typical insecure husband after that. I needed to find out everything, even if it hurt me, and it did. It hurt our commitments to each other and to God in front of friends and family. They were broken due to lust. I hope it wasn't love. I keep tormenting myself with the question, why? Could it be because I left her alone for extended periods while the Navy SEALs and I were involved in covert CIA operations? No, wait, I never served in the military, and the only SEALs I know are the ones sunbathing in the harbor. Could it be because I left her alone for work? That can't be. I don't go on business trips, and I hardly ever work overtime. I typically get home no later than 5:30 every evening. Maybe it's because I abandoned all my hobbies, left her and the kids to themselves, and had fun on my own, missing birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries. No, that's not the case. My only hobby is making her happy. She seemed to enjoy little surprise gifts and weekend getaways, and she had to keep an eye on me to ensure I didn't go overboard on those occasions. Fortunately, we didn't have a chance to have kids. I wasn't tough on her mentally or physically. I didn't neglect her, and I always made sure she knew I loved her. I spent as much time with her as possible. It helped that she had a job, otherwise she wouldn't have had time to be with Josh. The fact that he was her boss made their secret meetings convenient during the day. I was shocked when I obtained concrete evidence. It turned out to be a bit costly, possibly even illegal, but I didn't intend to use it in court. I decided to take the matter to the court of public opinion. It's evidence of their affair. Of course, the following attachments are explicit, so please don't open them if you think they might offend you. The next two images popped up. The first showed a top-down photo of Amy looking up at Josh lovingly. The caption read, "She's really good at this." The second was a series of images of them in bed, their faces reflecting desire and happiness. Below was the caption, "What she didn't do for me." I apologize if this offends you, but I needed to remove all doubt. Why am I showing you these pictures? Because I filed for divorce. Many of her friends have asked if I'm sure about this decision, if it's a mistake, if we should see a counselor, if she's sorry, if it won't happen again, or if we should try to forget it. Her mother, whom I loved as my own, won't try to make me change my mind. Her father, whom I respect but never truly loved, will attempt to reason with me. I'm sorry for involving all of you in this situation. My strongest desire is for you to leave me alone. This is primarily between my wife and me. Well, not entirely. I didn't account for Josh. I owe an apology to his wife, Sunny. You didn't deserve to face this, or to your two children, who are, 8 and 5 now? Perhaps he'll change, and you can forgive him. It's your choice. I also apologize to his company and its senior management for involving them in the impending lawsuit. In the end, all their meetings occurred in their office. I believe the supply staff now knows why there's a couch in his office. Just a suggestion, if you're giving that couch to someone else, make sure it's thoroughly clean first. I may not be able to use these pictures, but my attorney can obtain statements from their CO workers. I highly doubt they'd take responsibility for the company. In any case, many people will have difficult times ahead. To sum it up, here's why I chose to handle it this way: to eliminate all uncertainties and not waste any more time. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words, isn't it, Amy? Amy is about to be served with divorce papers, and it should happen any moment now. I'll try to start a new life without her. Amy, I'm sorry if I couldn't meet your needs. If, from the beginning, you had told me about your feelings for someone else and left, it would have hurt me. But I would have respected your decision. Instead, you chose to have your cake and eat it too. Well, the cake is gone. Amy, I'm pretty sure you'll regret it, or maybe not. Maybe you're relieved I found out, so you and your lover can live as you wish. It's over between us. I've moved out, taken what I needed, and everything else is yours. All communication will go through my lawyer, and I've made up my mind never to speak to you again. I don't want explanations. I don't want to know why. I don't want to hear about second chances, as I won't even consider them. Go ahead, Amy, leave me be. The entire office was shaken when Amy let out a scream and fainted at her desk upon seeing a picture of Josh with a knife through it. CO workers rushed to help her, and soon the news spread. An email containing the shocking information had been discovered by one of the administrators. Work came to a near standstill. Josh, unaware of the commotion, was startled to see the HR director standing at the door. "Is it true?" the director asked without preamble. "Is what true?" Josh replied, baffled. The director entered the room and closed the door behind him with a slam. "Is it true that you and Amy have been having an affair here in the office?" Josh turned pale, and the director could see he might faint. It was a clear confirmation. "You've been a fool. Do you realize the damage you and Amy have caused? Many of our major clients are religious charities. How do you think they'd react to the news that 2 of our senior employees engaged in inappropriate conduct on company premises during working hours?" After a brief pause, the director continued, his breath heavy. "I've just come from a meeting with senior management. The CEO called and demanded verification. He's already received calls from the Archbishop, the president of a Baptist charity, and Rabbi Fredman. Things are not looking good." He paused again and stared at Josh. "I want you out of here in 15 minutes. You are suspended pending an investigation." "No, wait, make it half an hour. As we speak, Amy is being escorted out of the office, which you haven't seen yet. Check your email for the message her husband sent," the director added as he left. Josh's hands trembled as he hit the button. What had started as a casual secret affair was now causing chaos in their lives. He had hoped it would remain fun and hidden from everyone, but their feelings for each other had intensified, leading to promises that their spouses wouldn't discover their infidelity. He realized that Sunny, Josh's wife, Must be in a desperate situation. "Oh my God, Sonny!" he exclaimed loudly and quickly dialed her number. To his surprise, she answered the call, seemingly calm. Maybe she hadn't seen the email yet. Her voice, cold and emotionless, broke the silence. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is what true, sweetheart?" Josh replied, aware that he had no other option. "Josh, you have one chance to tell me the truth, just one. If you deny it, and I catch you in a lie, our conversations will be handled by lawyers. So, is it true?" The walls were closing in on him and he loved her, but he had no choice. "I'm so sorry, honey." "Yes, it's true," he confessed, but she cut him off abruptly, her voice sharp and unyielding. "I'm packing 2 suitcases with your favorite things. They'll be in the garage. Come get them while I pick up the kids from school. I'd go myself, but at least one of us has to act like the responsible adult here, especially when there are kids involved. For now, I'll tell them you had to leave for a business trip. Understand one thing, if I decide not to attempt to salvage everything, you'll be the one explaining to our kids why Dad doesn't live here anymore. They won't understand now, but they will in a few years. I hope it doesn't push them away from you. I'm leaving. Please don't attempt to reach out to me. If I decide to, I'll initiate the contact." There was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, then came a piercing scream. "Damn you!" she yelled before abruptly ending the call, leaving him staring at his phone like a snake before he let it slip from his grip. Almost immediately, the phone began to ring. Glancing at the caller ID that displayed Amy, he answered hesitantly. For a minute, all he heard were the sounds of crying and sniffling. Then she spoke, her voice so hushed he could barely recognize it. Josh, what are we going to do? He's my life. We were planning to start a family next year. I can't bear to lose him. I can't." For the 20th time that day, he was overwhelmed with a profound sense of sadness. What have we done? He wondered aloud. "I feel the same way about Sonny, but honestly, Amy, I don't see a happy ending for either of us. If we truly loved each other, we might embrace our freedom and be together. However, we liked each other, yet we never intended to be together. You know, our careers are over, if not now, then very soon. Sonny has kicked me out, and I'm uncertain if we'll ever be together again. I'm genuinely sorry for Ben. Do you think that if I talked to him, explaining there was no love, it might help? Or I'm willing to do that." "No," she replied resolutely. "I believe the best thing for you right now is to keep as far away from us as possible. Every time he sees you, he'll remember what we did. He's never been violent, but he's never been hurt like this. I'll speak to you later only if I believe it's a good idea." She paused briefly before adding, "No, I don't think it's a good idea. All they need to do is discover that we're communicating, and that would undermine everything we're trying to rebuild. I'm sorry it has come to this, Amy. You know, I never meant to hurt you." "I feel the same way," she replied with a sigh. "I hope things work out with Sonny. I know how much you love her. I can't believe we were ever that foolish. Goodbye, Josh, and good luck with that." She hung up, leaving Josh alone with his thoughts. As promised, Ben never spoke to Amy again. He remained uncooperative, refusing negotiations and court-mandated counseling sessions. Instead, he opted to face a contempt charge, turning up at the office to be served with the charge by the jail. Confused police officers took his statement, and after no arrest warrant was issued, the judge expressed skepticism but sent him to jail over the following weekends, releasing him on Sunday nights so he could attend work. Amy eventually canceled the counseling sessions, admitting defeat. The divorce proceedings dragged on for nearly a year. Amy still harbored a flicker of hope that Ben would return, but when her mother saw an announcement of his upcoming wedding, she gave up hope. On Ben's wedding day, Amy, overwhelmed by emotions, got drunk for the first time in 2 years. While time might not completely heal all wounds, it made the pain more bearable. Eventually, Amy began dating again. She had 2 serious relationships that ended without her sharing her past, but she finally met a man who loved her enough to let the past remain behind and focus on the future. They married, and they were happy. Amy was cautious in her interactions with other men, particularly at work. Her colleagues jokingly referred to her as a nun because she rarely attended social events and kept her conversations with men strictly work-related. 2 years after her wedding, she unexpectedly ran into Ben. He had left town after reaching a confidential settlement with her former company to avoid a court case. He was back in town for his sister's 25th wedding anniversary celebration. Amy saw him sitting on a park bench by chance. Initially, she wasn't sure it was him. He appeared thinner and had some gray hair. She considered speaking to him to finally apologize for her actions, but changed her mind when a tall woman with fiery red hair approached, holding a boy around 2 years old and a girl of about 6 or 7 years. The girl had red curls like her mother's, and the boy had dark curls. The girl leaped into Ben's lap, and the woman took the younger one in her arms. Ben rose, holding the girl, kissed the woman, and left. Amy realized that she had caught a glimpse of the future that was supposed to be hers and wiped away her tears. She returned home to prepare her husband's favorite dinner. Josh and Sunny managed to reconcile after 15 months of separation. She insisted on counseling, both individually and as a couple, and they also established a rigorous prenuptial agreement. Josh apologized so much that Sunny eventually lost her patience and warned him that one more apology would lead to her departure. Josh transformed into a different person, rarely leaving Sunny's side, and he became a devoted family man. His new job paid less than his previous one, but he received raises and bonuses for his hard work. It took him 6 years to regain his footing, and Sunny continued to work to make ends meet. Despite their reconciliation, she refused to give up her job. She occasionally went out with colleagues for drinks or attended quarterly work seminars, and her independence bothered Josh, but she was secretly pleased by it. Their life was different from the past, but they were committed to building a better future for themselves and their children. One day, Josh realized that he and Amy had been living a bed life approximately 12 times, with an average duration of 30 to 45 minutes. Considering the longest estimate, it amounted to about 9 hours, a stark contrast to the years of suffering and the devastation of Amy's marriage. Was it worth it? Absolutely not.
I'm a construction foreman. My job isn't glamorous, but it's solid work that pays the bills and keeps me grounded. It's the kind of work that's straightforward, you put in the effort, and you see the results. My wife, on the other hand, has a more creative job as a graphic designer. It's not a field I fully understand, but I respect it. She often jokes about how we're opposites in our work lives, her in the world of color and creativity, and me in the world of measurements and deadlines. That balance, I've always thought, worked for us. It kept things interesting without stepping on each other's toes. One evening, we had plans to meet some friends at a bar we all liked. It wasn't a flashy place, but it had a charm of its own. Nestled in a small alleyway, the bar was an open-air setup with string lights hanging overhead and a relaxed atmosphere that made it a favorite for our group. My wife and I ended up running late that night. She's always got one more thing to finish before we leave, and I've gotten used to waiting. By the time we arrived, the group was already deep in a heated discussion. As soon as we got there, I could tell something serious was being debated. I asked what was going on, and someone explained that one of our mutual friends, a woman I didn't know well but had seen around, had decided to try an open relationship. That sparked a strong debate within the group. The room seemed split between those who thought it was progressive and those who thought it was nonsense. Naturally, I had no problem stating my opinion. To me, the whole idea seemed ridiculous. I made it clear that I believed open relationships were just a fancy way to dress up infidelity. It didn't matter how anyone tried to justify it, sharing your partner with someone else was crossing a line in my book. Some people nodded in agreement, but others, including my wife, took a softer stance. She didn't outright defend the friend but suggested that people should be free to make their own choices without judgment. That irked me a little. It felt like she was trying to justify something I saw as fundamentally wrong. The conversation went back and forth for a while. Everyone had their say, and the mood shifted between serious and light-hearted. Eventually, someone changed the subject, and the tension eased. It wasn't worth fighting over all night, but I couldn't help wondering what my wife really thought about it. She's usually on the same page with me about big things, so seeing her take a more neutral stance was something I tucked away in the back of my mind. As the evening wore on, the topic shifted to work. Since most of the group were friends from my wife's job, they started talking about an upcoming company event. Apparently, her department was hosting a corporate party, and they'd invited people from nearby departments as well. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Her company's office culture had never sat well with me. Without naming names, let's just say that some of their attitudes and values didn't align with mine. It wasn't long before people started heading home. I asked my wife if she planned to attend the corporate party, hoping she'd say no. I wasn't keen on her being around those people, especially the ones from the other departments. I didn't trust them, and I've always been protective of her, maybe more than she'd like. She's independent, sure, but I've got my boundaries, and I don't think that's a bad thing. To my surprise, she said she wanted to go. She explained that she was excited to meet new people and learn more about the other teams. It'll be fun, she said. I didn't push back at the moment, but something about it didn't sit right with me. For now, I decided to let it go, but in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. Later that evening, when we got home, I decided to bring up the earlier conversation from the bar. It wasn't something I could just let slide without asking about. As we settled in, I asked her why she defended that friend. Do you really think open relationships make any sense? Or do you think she's just trying to justify cheating? Maybe her boyfriend is too weak to stand up for himself, I said. I wasn't trying to pick a fight, but I wanted an honest answer. She looked at me calmly and shrugged. I wouldn't try it myself, she said, but it's not about us, is it? Some people live like that. If you hear about it so often, it must be popular in certain circles. Maybe it works for them. Her tone was neutral, almost dismissive, but her words didn't sit well with me. I'm not the type to overthink things, but I couldn't help wondering why she'd even entertain the idea as something valid. But don't get me wrong, she added quickly, probably noticing the look on my face. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying it's out there. And sure, it probably feels freeing for some people to have that kind of arrangement while still being close to someone. But again, that's not for me. Don't start overthinking this, okay? Her words were clear, but something about the way she spoke felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I decided not to press further. Sometimes it's better to let things rest. All right, I said, leaning back on the couch. As long as you're not seriously considering it, I'm fine. It just seems like a messy way to live. I tried to push the topic out of my head, but it lingered in the background. I've always been straightforward, and the concept of complicating relationships like that didn't make sense to me. Still, I took her at her word and decided to move on. After a pause, she changed the subject. By the way, she started, do you remember my sister from Austria? It took me a second to place her. We hadn't seen each other in years, but I nodded. She's coming to visit next week, she continued. She'll probably stay for about a week or so. It'll be nice to have her here for a bit. That caught me off guard. Her sister and I had never been particularly close. Not because of any bad blood, but just because we'd never had much reason to interact. What's bringing her here? I asked. Is it just a casual visit, or is something going on? She's dealing with some issues back home with her parents, my wife explained. She didn't get into the details, but it sounds like she needs a break. She'll be staying with us for a while to clear her head. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't pry too much. She'll talk about it if she feels like it. Her tone was firm but kind, and I could tell she wanted me to let the matter be. I shrugged. All right, that's fine. If she needs a place to stay and you're okay with it, I'm okay with it too. We'll make it work. I didn't mind having a guest in the house, as long as it didn't turn into some long-term arrangement. For now, though, I had no reason to push back, so I let the conversation end there. The night of the corporate event arrived, and my wife was getting ready with her usual attention to detail. I watched her from the couch, scrolling through my phone. Before she left, I told her, make sure to check in with me, all right? At least a quick text every hour or so. She rolled her eyes but smiled. Sure, I'll let you know how it's going, she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before heading out the door. I wasn't thrilled about the event, but I trusted her to stick to her word. After she left, I settled in with my phone. As I scrolled through a group chat with some of the guys, a familiar name popped up. They were talking about that woman who had decided to try an open relationship. Turns out, she worked in one of the departments involved in tonight's corporate event. The chat was buzzing with opinions, and most of them weren't flattering. Words like justifying cheating and attention seeker were thrown around. It didn't surprise me. Her reputation wasn't exactly stellar, and people didn't hold back when it came to sharing their thoughts. Reading those messages made me think about my wife being at the same event. I couldn't help but wonder if she'd end up talking to that woman. Not that I'd expect anything to come of it, but the idea of her mingling with people I didn't trust didn't sit well with me. I shook it off, reminding myself that she said she'd check in. That would be enough to keep my mind at ease, or so I thought. An hour passed, then another. I realized I hadn't heard from her. I glanced at my phone, expecting to see a message, but there was nothing. I decided to call her. The phone rang a few times before going to voicemail. That's when the irritation started creeping in. She'd promised to keep in touch, and now she wasn't picking up. I tried to convince myself that she was probably busy or had left her phone in her bag. Still, it didn't do much to calm my nerves. Figuring there was no point in sitting around stewing, I called a few friends and invited them over to watch the game. If she wasn't going to check in, I might as well enjoy the evening. The guy showed up, and for a while, I was able to push the situation out of my mind. We watched the game, cracked open a few beers, and talked about everything except my wife's silence. But even after they left, the house felt empty, and the clock kept ticking. By now, it was late. Too late for someone who said they'd keep me updated. My patience was running thin, and I started pacing around the living room. Just as I was about to call her again, I heard the front door open. She walked in, looking surprisingly composed. "You're late," I said, my voice edged with frustration. She didn't seem fazed. "I know." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "We met some great people tonight. A few of them are new to the city, so we decided to show them around a bit. That's why I lost track of time." Her explanation was calm and matter-of-fact, but it didn't erase my irritation. At least she wasn't drunk, which was something I'd half expected. "Look, I'll tell you all about it tomorrow," she added, clearly trying to wind down the conversation. She gave me a quick kiss goodnight before heading upstairs. Reluctantly, I followed. I had plenty of questions, but they would have to wait. For now, we both went to bed, and I tried to push the evening out of my mind. The next morning, as we sat at the kitchen table with coffee in hand, I decided to ask her about the previous night. "Why didn't you pick up when I called?" I said, trying to keep my tone calm but firm. She looked up from her mug, slightly startled but not defensive. "Oh, that," she said. "I'm sorry. My phone was in my bag the whole time. I didn't hear it ring." She shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "We were just walking around, talking. It wasn't anything crazy." Her explanation didn't fully satisfy me, but I decided to hear her out. "And who were you with, exactly?" I pressed. She set her cup down and started explaining. "I actually met that woman everyone's been talking about," she said, referring to the one who had opened her relationship. "She's not at all like the rumors make her out to be." She told me the whole story, and apparently, it was her boyfriend's idea in the first place. They both agreed to it, so it's not like she's just out there cheating. I frowned. "You know the guys and I were talking about her too, right? We've heard she's been with half the office, and there's plenty of proof to back it up." She shook her head, looking unimpressed. "That's all nonsense," she said firmly. "People love to exaggerate and spread rumors." She seemed genuine to me, not like some drama queen trying to justify bad behavior. Honestly, I think she's just misunderstood. Her defense of this woman irritated me. "I don't think you should be hanging around her," I said plainly. "People like that have a way of pulling others into their mess, even if it's unintentional." She rolled her eyes, and I could tell she was getting annoyed. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "If I wanted to pull something like that, as you put it, I would have done it a long time ago. But I haven't, because I don't want to. Can you trust me on that?" Her irritation was starting to wear on me, but I decided to back off. "Fine," I said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just be careful. People like that can influence you without you even realizing it. That's all I'm saying." She didn't respond, instead taking another sip of her coffee and staring out the window. It was clear we weren't going to agree on this one. Before the tension could linger, she changed the subject. "Anyway," she said, "my sister is coming tomorrow." That caught my attention. "Already?" I asked. I thought we had more time to get things ready. She shook her head. Nope, she'll be here tomorrow. So, we need to make sure the guest room is sorted and everything looks nice. I sighed, mentally running through the list of things that needed to be done. It wasn't a huge task, but it wasn't nothing either. All right, I said. Let's get it done tonight. I'll take care of the heavy lifting. She nodded, seemingly relieved that the conversation had shifted to something more practical. With that, the mood lightened slightly. We finished our coffee and started planning the rest of the day, focusing on getting the house ready for her sister's arrival. As much as the earlier conversation lingered in my mind, I decided to let it go for now. There were more pressing things to take care of, and the last thing I needed was another argument before her sister even got here. Her sister arrived the next day, just as my wife had said. As soon as she walked through the door, there was a flurry of hugs and greetings. I stood to the side for a moment, letting the two of them have their reunion before stepping in to say hello. Her sister looked tired but relieved, and I could tell that being here meant a lot to her. After the initial excitement settled, we all moved to the dining table, where my wife had already set out some snacks and coffee. While my wife and her sister caught up, I helped bring her luggage upstairs to the guest room. Once everything was set down, I asked her if she needed anything else. She shook her head and said, "No, this is perfect. Thank you." We started chatting casually as she unpacked, and that's when she brought it up herself. "I really appreciate you letting me stay here for a while," she said, her tone sincere. "It's been tough lately with my parents." I paused for a moment before replying. "If you don't mind me asking, what happened?" I figured that if she was opening the door to this topic, it wouldn't hurt to ask. She sighed, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "It's not a secret," she said. "I'm a lesbian. I came out to them recently, and they didn't take it well. Actually, they didn't take it at all. It turned into a massive argument, and things have been pretty bad ever since. I needed some space to clear my head, so I decided to come here." I nodded, taking it all in. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "But for what it's worth, you're welcome here for as long as you need. Family's supposed to have your back, even when they don't agree with everything." She smiled faintly and said, "Thanks. That means a lot." It wasn't much, but I could tell it helped to hear someone say it. When we came back downstairs, my wife was already making plans. "I was thinking," she said, "we could spend some time exploring the city. I have this new friend who knows all the best spots. She's been raving about this little coffee shop and some great local markets. It'll be fun." Her sister seemed excited about the idea, and I didn't see any harm in it, so I just nodded along. They deserved some time to relax, especially after everything her sister had been through. Not long after, my phone buzzed. It was my father. "We've got a problem with the shed," he said, sounding stressed. "The structure's giving out, and it's about to collapse on the fence. I need your help to take it down before it causes more damage." I sighed, knowing this wasn't something I could put off. When my dad called for help, it was always urgent. I explained the situation to my wife and her sister. "Looks like I'll be heading out to help my dad," I said. "You two go ahead with your plans. Explore the city, have a good time. Just keep me posted on where you're going." My wife nodded, understanding the urgency. "Of course," she said. "We'll manage. Don't worry about us." It wasn't how I'd planned to spend the day, but priorities are priorities. I grabbed my things, gave my wife a quick kiss, and headed out the door. As I left, I glanced back to see the two of them chatting animatedly about their itinerary. It was good to see her sister smiling again, even if it meant I'd miss out on the day with them. After hours of hard work helping my father dismantle the shed, I was exhausted but satisfied with the progress we'd made. The structure had been a disaster waiting to happen, and while we hadn't finished the job entirely, we'd at least managed to stabilize things and prevent any immediate damage. It was one of those days where physical labor cleared my mind, and I was looking forward to heading home, taking a shower, and relaxing. When I walked through the door, However, my plans for a quiet evening vanished immediately. Sitting in the living room were my wife, her sister, and two guests I recognized instantly, my wife's new friend and her boyfriend. The pair struck an odd image. Their clothes were flashy, almost costume-like, and their whole vibe screamed attention seekers. I nodded a polite hello, though inwardly I was already bracing myself for what was to come. I joined them in the living room, grabbing a drink from the kitchen on the way. The atmosphere was casual, but it didn't take long before the conversation shifted into familiar territory. The friend and her boyfriend were once again singing the praises of open relationships, going on about how freeing and transformative they were. They spoke with a missionary zeal, as if trying to convert everyone in the room to their way of thinking. I listened for a while, trying to keep my patience. Eventually, I'd had enough. "Look," I said, cutting into their monologue. "You can talk it up all you want, but to me, it's just an excuse for people who can't commit. Relationships aren't supposed to be a free-for-all. If you can't stick with one person, maybe you shouldn't be in a relationship at all." My tone was firm but calm, though I could see their expressions change immediately. The boyfriend shot back, "That's such a closed-minded way of looking at it. People are different, and relationships don't have to fit into some outdated mold. Maybe you should try thinking outside the box." His condescension grated on me, but I stayed composed. "Thinking outside the box doesn't mean throwing away basic respect and commitment," I replied. "If you want to live your life that way, fine, but don't act like it's some universal truth everyone else should follow." The argument escalated quickly from there. Voices were raised, points were repeated, and the tension in the room became unbearable. My wife and her sister tried to mediate, but it was clear that this wasn't going to end with anyone changing their minds. Eventually, the couple stood up, clearly frustrated. "Well, it's obvious you're not ready to have an open mind about this," the friend said, grabbing her bag. "Thanks for the evening, but we'll be going now." Her boyfriend followed suit, and just like that, they were gone. As the door closed behind them, I felt a mix of relief and lingering frustration. Before I could even sit down, my wife pulled me aside. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp. "Why couldn't you just let it go? You didn't have to turn it into a fight." I looked at her, trying to keep my own temper in check. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to that nonsense without saying something," I said. "If they can't handle a different opinion, that's their problem, not mine." She sighed, clearly exasperated. "It's not about agreeing with them," she said. "It's about keeping the peace." Now they're upset, and honestly, I'm upset too. You can't just banish everyone who doesn't think exactly like you. Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "I'm not banishing anyone," I said. "But I am saying I don't want you hanging around people like that. They're a bad influence, and you know it. The company you keep matters, whether you like it or not." That was the last straw for her. "You don't get to dictate who I'm friends with," she snapped. "I don't tell you who you can or can't spend time with, so don't try to control me." With that, she stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing there in the living room. I took a deep breath, realizing there was no point in continuing the argument tonight. Eventually, I followed her upstairs. Neither of us said another word as we got ready for bed, and the silence hung heavy between us as we turned out the lights and went to sleep. The morning started unusually quiet. When I woke up, the house was empty, which wasn't something I was used to. Normally, there was some movement, some noise from the kitchen, or at least a light on in the living room. Instead, I found only a note from my wife. It was short and to the point: "We went to the mall. Be back later." Though we obviously referred to her and her sister. I shrugged it off initially. It wasn't strange for them to spend time together, especially since her sister was visiting. As the hours passed, I waited for them to come back. When they finally arrived, it didn't take long to notice something was off. Her sister looked visibly upset. She wasn't crying or making a scene, but her mood was unmistakably low. I asked her if everything was all right, but she just waved me off with a faint smile and a mumbled "I'm fine." That might have been enough to convince someone else, but not me. Something was bothering her, and she wasn't saying what. This pattern repeated itself over the next few days. They would leave together, always giving vague explanations about where they were going, and return hours later. Every time, her sister's demeanor seemed worse. She became quieter, more withdrawn. I tried asking her again, but she gave me the same dismissive response. Nothing, she'd say, avoiding eye contact. My wife, on the other hand, acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. If anything, she seemed more animated than usual, chatting away about their outings as if nothing was wrong. By the fourth day, my patience was wearing thin. I'm not the kind of guy to jump to conclusions or get paranoid, but there was something undeniably strange about the whole situation. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something from me. It wasn't just her sister's behavior, it was the evasive way my wife avoided giving me straight answers about their plans. Every explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd prepared just enough to keep me from asking more questions. I started paying closer attention to their movements, hoping to pick up on anything that might explain what was going on. Each time they left the house, I'd ask casual questions about where they were going and what they planned to do. My wife would answer quickly and confidently, but her sister's silence spoke volumes. It was clear she wasn't comfortable, but I couldn't tell if it was because of me or something else entirely. On the fifth day, after another round of vague excuses and a particularly tense return home, I decided I'd had enough. There was only one way to get to the bottom of this. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by asking directly. My wife's laptop seemed like the most logical place to start. She used it for everything, from work to personal messages, so if there was anything to find, it would be there. Of course, I wasn't about to do something like that while she was around. It would have to wait until she left for work. She usually took her phone with her, but the laptop stayed at home most of the time. That gave me a window of opportunity. I didn't feel great about the idea of snooping, but the constant secrecy was getting to me. I needed to know what was going on, and if this was the only way to find out, so be it. By the time the day ended, I had a plan. I'd wait for her to leave in the morning, make sure her sister was occupied, and then check the laptop. If there was nothing, I'd drop it and move on. But if there was something, at least I'd finally have some clarity. For now, all I could do was wait and hope that whatever I found wouldn't make things worse. The morning started quietly. My wife had already left for work, and her sister was still asleep upstairs. It was the perfect moment to put my plan into action. I sat at the dining table, opened her laptop, and steeled myself for what I might find. I wasn't proud of resorting to this, but the constant secrecy had left me with no choice. I navigated to her messaging app and started scrolling through her recent conversations. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: work messages, a few casual chats with friends. But then I found the thread with her new friend. My gut told me to focus there, and within moments, I knew I'd struck something significant. Their conversation was casual at first, filled with emojis and light banter, but the tone shifted quickly. They were discussing open relationships again, and my wife was more enthusiastic than I'd expected. It's such a freeing concept, she'd written. Honestly, I think it's something every couple should consider. As I read further, my stomach tightened. She had written that she'd met someone. It's nothing serious, she'd said, but it feels amazing to have that kind of freedom. She went on to say that she planned to talk to me about opening our marriage that very evening. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a passing thought or a hypothetical conversation. She was serious, and she'd already crossed a line without saying a word to me. What angered me even more was the way they talked about her sister. Between discussing their so-called freedom, they made jokes at her expense. "She's so uptight," one message read. "I don't know how she'll ever survive without loosening up a bit." Another comment implied that her sister's issues with their parents were somehow her own fault. Reading those messages made my blood boil. Here was someone who had come to us for support, and instead of standing by her, my wife had been mocking her behind her back. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. My wife's behavior was one thing, but the way she treated her own sister was something else entirely. It explained so much about why her sister had been so withdrawn lately. She'd already faced rejection from their parents, and now she had to deal with this kind of treatment under our roof. I couldn't let it slide. I went upstairs and gently knocked on her sister's door. When she opened it, she looked groggy but managed a faint smile. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked. She nodded and sat down on the edge of the bed. I didn't beat around the bush. "Is this about why you've been upset lately?" I asked. "Is it because of what's been said behind your back?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then she sighed and nodded. "It's not just that," she said quietly. "I felt like I don't matter for a long time. First with our parents, and now even here. I thought coming here would be different, but," she trailed off, looking away. Her words hit me hard. This wasn't just about the messages, it was about a deeper sense of alienation and neglect. I decided to tell her everything. I explained what I'd found, sparing no details. Her expression shifted from hurt to anger as I spoke. When I finished, I proposed an idea. If she wants an open marriage, I said, let's give her one. But on our terms. I laid out a plan that would make her see the consequences of her choices. To my surprise, her sister didn't hesitate. "If that's what it takes to make her understand, I'm in," she said. Her resolve was clear, and for the first time in days, she looked like she had some fight left in her. We talked late into the morning, hashing out the details over coffee and, eventually, a couple of drinks. By the time we were done, we had a plan, and her sister seemed more at ease. I didn't know how this would play out, but one thing was certain, things were about to change in this house, and not on my wife's terms. It was early evening when I heard the sound of the front door slamming shut. My wife's voice echoed through the house before I even saw her. "We need to talk," she shouted, her tone sharp and commanding. I stayed where I was, upstairs in the bedroom, taking my time to respond. "Come up if you want to talk," I called back, my voice calm but deliberate. There was no urgency in my tone, and I knew that would only fuel her temper further. The sound of her heels clacking against the stairs filled the silence as she stormed up to the bedroom. Her determination was written all over her face when she appeared in the doorway. "I've made a decision," she began without preamble, her hands on her hips. "We're opening our marriage, and that's final. I'm tired of living by these outdated rules. I'm a strong, independent woman, and I refuse to be held back any longer." She spoke with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance. "Oh, is that right?" I said, my tone still even, as I leaned back against the headboard. "Why don't you come in and we can discuss it properly?" There was no hint of agitation in my voice, and I knew she wouldn't immediately catch on to the trap she was walking into. She stepped fully into the room, clearly ready to launch into another monologue, when her eyes landed on the scene before her. Her sister was kneeling in front of me, clearly engaged in something intimate. Her face twisted in disbelief, and for a moment, she was too stunned to speak. Then the reality hit her, and the explosion came. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice breaking. Her shock quickly turned into fury as she pointed an accusing finger at me. "How dare you? How could you do this to me?" I didn't move from my spot. "You wanted an open marriage," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "This is what it looks like. Or did you think it was only going to go one way? That you could have your freedom while I stayed here waiting for you?" My words were measured, deliberate, and each one seemed to push her closer to the edge. "This isn't what I meant," she yelled, her voice cracking. "You're disgusting. An open marriage doesn't mean you can just..." She gestured wildly toward her sister, unable to finish the sentence. "This is betrayal. Absolute betrayal." Her hypocrisy was almost laughable, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh. "You made your choice," I said, cutting her off. "You decided to bring someone else into our marriage without even talking to me first. You thought you could just dictate the terms and expect me to fall in line. Well, congratulations, you got what you wanted. But you don't get to cry about it now." I stood up, my voice rising just enough to make it clear that I was done entertaining her theatrics. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. Enjoy it somewhere else. She stared at me, her face a mix of rage and disbelief, before turning on her heel and storming out. The sound of her stomping down the stairs and slamming the front door behind her echoed through the house. I stood there for a moment, the silence settling in after her departure. Her sister remained where she was, unbothered by the commotion, and I leaned back, letting the tension drain from the room. She'd made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of control returning, even if the situation was far from resolved. After the explosive confrontation, the house was finally quiet again. I turned to her sister, who was still composed despite everything that had just unfolded. "Thanks for having my back," I said, meaning it. It wasn't the kind of situation anyone would willingly walk into, and yet, she hadn't hesitated. Her support in that moment meant more than I could put into words. She gave a small shrug and a faint smile. "It's no problem," she said. "Honestly, this whole thing has made me think about a lot of things in my own life. Maybe it's time for me to stop holding back and start being honest about what I want, too." Her words carried a weight that I didn't miss. It was clear that she wasn't just talking about the events of the evening, but about deeper issues she'd been grappling with for a long time. As the reality of what had just happened settled in, I knew there was no going back. I needed to make a decision, and I'd already made it. While my wife's betrayal had been the final straw, it was clear that the cracks in our marriage had been forming long before this. There was no sense in dragging it out any longer. I started gathering her things, methodically going through the house and collecting everything that belonged to her. Clothes, shoes, books, and anything else I could find. I didn't rush, taking the time to make sure I didn't miss anything. As I worked, her sister stayed nearby, occasionally helping when I asked, but mostly just keeping me company. We talked as I packed, and the conversation turned to their past. "You know," she began hesitantly, "she's always been like this. Self-centered, manipulative. Even when we were kids, she'd find ways to make everything about her. If I ever tried to stand up for myself, she'd just tear me down until I gave up." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of pain that she couldn't quite hide. Hearing that didn't surprise me, but it did add another layer to the situation. "So, she bullied you?" I asked, glancing over as I folded another shirt into a box. Her sister nodded. "Yeah, but I didn't really think of it that way at the time. I just dealt with it. It's not like our parents did anything about it, and after a while, I just stopped reacting. I guess she took that as a green light to keep going." I shook my head, disgusted but not shocked. "Well, she's not going to be my problem anymore," I said firmly. "You don't deserve that, and neither do I. She's made her choices, and now she gets to live with them." Her sister gave me a small nod, her expression unreadable but contemplative. It was clear that she had a lot to process, just like I did. By the time I finished packing, there were several bags and boxes stacked neatly by the door. Each one felt like a small weight lifted off my shoulders. I took a deep breath, stepping back to look at the pile. It was a tangible reminder that I was taking control of the situation, that I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of my life any longer. With everything in place, I opened the door and moved the bags and boxes outside. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a sense of resolution. She'd made her decisions, and now she would have to face the consequences of them. Once the last box was set down by the door, I turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me. For the first time in